I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
I mean, dude,
all of my holiday notes are just quotes, like, because those are all very straightforward.
Yeah.
Most of them, anyway.
I mean, my first page of notes in this little, legal pad I have is just up to page 8. So I was just
Yeah.
a lot of shit coming at you fast in that first part.
Mine's like the first 5, and then I was like, fuck it, I need to type this because I'm taking too many notes, and I'm like using all, like, I don't want to waste a whole fucking notebook on Ben Lerner. Just not on 80 pages of Ben Lerner essay where there is no clear thesis until the end and kind of spattered throughout, which is fine. Like, whatever. That I can deal with.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say even typed my first page goes up to page 11.
Perfect day to be discussing poetry theories.
Would you call it theory? I guess we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd probably argue that this is mostly a theory. But yeah. All right, so this is Heavy Board. My name is Andrew Wittstadt.
I'm Sophie Weiner.
And today we're talking about The Hatred of Poetry by Ben Lerner. The Hatred of Poetry. Hatred. Provocative title.
Sexy.
It is. I don't know why I thought this was originally published by Grey Wolf. I guess that's... But it's not.
FSG.
Yeah. And this was originally published in 2016.
Yeah, you can feel that. You can definitely feel that reading.
Yeah.
So is this the first Ben Lerner you've ever read?
Yeah, this is the first Ben Lerner I've ever read. I haven't read any of his novels or his books of poetry. I've heard good things about his novels, not so much about his poetry, but...
I have, I read 1004. That's one of his novels, one of his 2 big novels. So he has 1004 and Leaving the Otochi Station. Is that what's called?
Yeah.
Whatever. But he has those 2 books. I read 1004.
His latest
very
one.
autofiction, very sexy. It was one of those things where it's like not bad writing. Like there's something in it that's smart, but also very annoying. And that's not to like shit on him at all. It's just also how I feel about autofiction 99.9% of the time.
Is his stuff autofiction?
1004 definitely is. I don't know about the others.
His latest one I know because it was just literally every time you picked up, whenever I guess it came out in like 2019, the Topeka School. And that, I just know that title and everything because it was every time you picked up a Harper's or a New Yorker or something, it was talking about Ben Lerner's The Topeka
I don't
School.
know. I think I walked away from Ben Lerner in like 2016 and just decided no more. I just decided that I needed a break. Okay, full disclosure, I like read him in a class. Was not really pleased with the class overall. Have a lot of negative associations. So that could be part of it.
What was the class?
Had to give it up. Recent fiction.
Okay.
It was a lit class. So it was all contemporary fiction. It was all really, really recent. Like last, at the time I was taking the class, all fiction that had been published probably within like the last couple of years, maybe. Like, so all of the books that we were reading, some of them were up for big prizes maybe that year.
Huh.
Yeah, like, I mean, we read The Sympathizer in this class by Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Was
We also read Sheila Heti. We read Paul Beatty. It was good. But yeah, a bunch of other stuff. Station 11 we read.
oh shit, have you been watching the series?
No, I knew it was a thing, but no, we haven't been watching it.
Yeah, I haven't been watching it either. I heard it was good. I've never read the book, but I heard people liked it.
No, I've exclusively been watching garbage. Like really trashy Netflix. Let's not have sex shows.
Let's not have sex shows. Yeah, man. All right. Fucking Ben Lerner. I've been watching nothing but. All right, so I guess let's give a quick overview of this for listeners. So if we'd like, we'll read this little bio in the book here for those that don't know. Ben Lerner's a pretty big figure here in at least contemporary literature. So Lerner was born in Topeka, Kansas, received fellowships from Fulbright, Guggenheim, and MacArthur. I mean, those are all the most prestigious fellowships you could ever get. He has all three, and is the author of now three internationally acclaimed novels, 1004, and I think, the most recent is the Topeka School, but that's not in this one because this book was published in 2016. Three poetry collections that I've never read, and I guess at the time of this book, he was a professor at Brooklyn College in New York. I don't know if he still teaches there. Does he still teach there? Probably, I would think.
I wouldn't be surprised, but I have no idea.
I wouldn't be surprised because I mean it's not like professorships, like full professor jobs, are just like everywhere right now. But if you're somebody like Ben Lerner with three of the most prestigious fellowships in the world behind your name, you could probably change jobs pretty easily in that profession. But yeah. I would assume so, yeah, unless we know otherwise. This is how well prepared we are. We have no idea. All right, what do you want to do with this, Soph? Where do you want to start with this? I have a few things we could start with, but we may
I think we have to start with something pretty important. I think we have to start. Well, okay, in my mind, we have to start with Marianne Moore.
I had a couple questions.
Because that's where, yeah, go on.
Well, I had a couple questions we could either just like, because we could go very quickly into something out of left field with these, or we could come back to them at the end if we wanted to. I don't know if we'd be burned out. First one Tell me
what they are.
First one is poetry dead? We could start with that. And this is one that you and I have talked about a little bit, and you have a few ideas on this that I'm interested in. I don't know if you want to get into it, where it's, who are defenses of poetry for, right? Like, what is the audience for these defenses of poetry type thing? Because there are a lot. I mean, there are...
As are denunciations, and are they for the same audience?
Right, stuff like that. I don't know if you wanted to start with that before we actually break down.
Yeah, well,
Lerner's opinions on that. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we'll probably start touching on this and then come back to it, sort of as we work through all of our ideas about the book. But I mean, is poetry dead? Well, Is this the question that this essay seeks to answer? Did we mention that it's an essay, that this book of 86 pages is just an essay?
Yeah, it's kind of a rambling,
small little book.
Personal essay,
at one
too,
point,
yeah.
To as a monograph. But yeah, is poetry dead? I think that's a big question. I think it's a sexy question, and I don't...
Get lots of hits, dude. Get lots of hits for this episode.
I mean, I don't know if it matters is the problem, like, is my inherent problem with the question. Like, dead to whom?
I
I think
guess.
you have to answer the audience question before you answer that. Like, because to any, like, a massive portion of the world population at any given moment, yes, poetry is dead and actually probably never really existed. Uh,
Right.
but I think for people who love poetry, like, is contemporary poetry fucked? I think is a better question than is poetry dead? Like, I think that people will keep reading Dickinson for many years to come.
Right.
In that sense, poetry isn't dead.
Or they at least keep
Does
pretending.
contemporary poetry suck? Probably mostly. But I would say that's historically probably also true.
Yeah.
Like that most of the poems and poets of any given moment are terrible or just mediocre. And just right now, our access is so much greater,
Right.
that there's so much more, that it would appear that like poetry just kind of sucks right now. It's also like, you know, always going to be like, I guess since access to it is much wider than it has been historically, because, you know, it's not like it's like been accessible to the average person for a lot of our literary history.
Yeah. And I think we'll get into this one week because Lerner does make some hints at an idea like this. Whereas, like, yeah, I mean, you know, any given year, if you look at all the art that came out, and any, this goes beyond poetry, but any genre or craft of art, you look at it, yeah, most of it isn't good, right? Most of it is not good. And there's a few gems that come out. And, you know, we try to reward those gems. Think if we're talking strictly books, let's try to keep it books just for the purposes of this shit. It's like, all right, we have these committees that give out awards. They usually give them out to the ones that they, you know, we would consider the better ones that year or the best ones that year, you know, ideally. That's the lofty ideal behind it, at least. So there's always a lot, and, you know, of the 5 books that get nominated for, you know, National Book Awards, you know, there's thousands that were published. I mean, you know, like, it's not that. But if I were to narrow this down, since we're not just going all over the place, if somebody asked me point blank, is poetry dead? My short answer would just be yes.
Yeah, I know it would.
It's over. It's done. It's been over. Not
yeah, I
that,
think
like,
I don't know. I think I'd say no, but yeah, how we define this might be different.
yeah, not that. That isn't to say that it doesn't exist anymore, right? But I guess, and Lerner kind of hints at this when he quotes Grossman, but like when Grossman, I think, kind of describes this the best way, where, yeah, of course it's not dead. I mean, this is just an art form. Like, it's always going to be practiced. It's been practiced for thousands and thousands of years before any of us were in existence, and then it'll probably be practiced for thousands and thousands of years after our existence. You know, so me declaring that means nothing. But yeah, I would say so, probably. And Lerner doesn't even really try to defend people that are saying poetry is dead, but he does keep referencing it. I noticed throughout the essay, he just keeps referencing it, like, those that say poetry is dead or is being killed or is done, and I'm just like, yeah, but like, who's saying this? And like, is it just random people
so I think that,
in like the comments on his, you know, social media pages? Like, is it just random folks, or is it somebody like Grossman who makes a coherent? Yeah.
Well, and I think that's part of the problem with this overall essay, and we can get into that, is that, you know, there is relatively little cited. Some critics are cited as having declared at some point poetry dead, and he does make reference to those moments, and he does make reference to various historical and recent defenses of poetry, although I don't know that he makes many references to many recent so-called defenses, though we see them often. And I think that sort of the trying to figure out why we come back to these two places over and over again. Why periodically we see either these like denunciations of poetry or this, poetry is dead kind of statement. So, someone will put out an essay somewhere about that, and then we'll get something that says, like Dana Joya's Can Poetry Matter that came out in The Atlantic, and that was in the early 90s, and that sort of stuck around too. But
this was I remember at
these over and over again.
I guess for context, since this is one of the more contemporary books we've done so far on the pod, it's like we should say for context, like right around this time, like the 2015, 2016, I saw a lot of just like New York Times op-eds, Atlantic, Guardian, stuff like this, like shorter form, obviously, because they're like, 1,000-word op-eds or whatever, just about how poetry is back or needed or some type of...
Well, yeah, we were in the midst of like a national political meltdown.
Yeah.
Right. Like, well, and like in all of the spheres, like in the academic world,
Right.
This is like, poetry is kicking back up, or at least, I don't know, maybe it just became more obvious. It was already very much happening. Like this was already very, very apparent, I think. But, poetry of resistance became more commonly like discussed, which I say more commonly, but like, I mean, come on, like that's been around forever. Like it just like has these moments probably of extreme popularity or like pockets of it where it's like, or maybe I'm just describing being a college student when you're like resistance or whatever, but yeah, or this idea of poetry as like some great political force, which I tend to like disagree with, because for that I think you need a much broader audience.
That, and I saw a lot of trend in those op-eds that came out around that time. You'll still see one every once in a while, just flutter through. If anybody that subscribes to the Times, you'll see them flutter through op-ed pages or something, like a guest writer, a big poet, somebody like Lerner, or somebody, in Lerner's realm, like just a big status, writer or poet, or somebody will write some defense. And a lot of what I see is they'll quote statistics from like Instagram, especially Instagram poets and book sales. And Instagram poets sell a lot of books. They sell a lot of books compared to other poetry. And people say, well, that means that poetry is thriving, back. I'm not sure I buy that.
Yeah.
Because I'm
At
not
the
so
same
much...
time, you also had like... Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, because I'm not so much sure that when people are buying what we would call, quote unquote, Instagram poetry books, I'm not sure that they're buying it because they love poetry. You know what I mean? Or I'm not sure they're buying it for the poetry. They're buying it because poetry is, I mean, this is one of the reasons I say it's dead, or I would argue that it's dead, at least now. Not that it couldn't, I mean, when somebody says dead, maybe it is hyperbolic, right? Like, how could something like an art form be dead? Like how it's still there. Like, it's not like it disappeared. But yeah, I would say that, yeah, social media has usurped. Yeah, social media usurped the art.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the defenses of your argument, if I were to play devil's advocate, and go to your side, was that, like, how many people have you met that are writers of poetry, but not really avid readers of it? Or who, like, I mean, there's something to be said, I think, for reading broadly and reading everything. And,
Sure.
I certainly have not successfully done that. Right. I don't think I would be here if I had.
Yeah, I mean, read widely and broadly, and everybody has their taste. So I mean, just because I don't have a taste for whatever is the big selling, Instagram thing right now, if you enjoy it, right? Like, don't take my word for it. Who the fuck am I? Like, but yeah,
Of course, but like you don't have to, have any. It's also part of just like living in a moment where you don't have to have any acquaintance with the, traditions of poetry in order to like execute a poem.
Yeah, and you don't have to go through kind of the traditional means. So, like, back in the day, if you didn't know Ezra Pound, well, then you probably weren't getting in the magazines, right? Like, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's an everyday thing. It's just he references a couple times people saying that yeah, it's dead or it's dying, and I don't know. We'll see
Yeah.
what happens with that. Do you want to get into the other one or just into the books? Like, who are these defenses for? Or are we gonna hit that as we go? Come back to it. Give an answer
Oh, we
now.
gotta hit that as we go.
Who are these
I
defenses?
think that
Yeah,
you should bring it back up when the moment feels right.
yeah.
Um, because I really want to talk about, like, before we get too far into the sort of abstract questions of shit. Generally, I want to start with like the thing that I feel like the the whole essay kind of has laying over it, or maybe it just sort of rests on. I don't know what the right metaphor is for this, but like the thing that incites in some way the rest of this essay is like his sort of meditation on Marianne Moore's poem Poetry. Famous poem. Notably, there are two versions of it. There is a long version and a short version. I think it is good to be familiar with both versions. I think that the long one definitely gives you greater insight to this poem, though you don't necessarily need it. I don't think you need it to understand what is being said in this poem, but I questioned throughout reading this entire essay whether I believed in Ben Lerner's reading of this poem, which like frustrates the shit out of me because Ben Lerner's smart as shit. Like there's no getting around that. And we can get into other opinions later.
That's a genius, Grant.
Well, but like he's a smart dude, has an academic understanding of poems. There are just basic things about, I think, what this poem is actually about that are never touched. And so this poem called Poetry famously starts with the line, "I too dislike it." It here being poetry. Reading it, however, it goes on, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. We don't have to go into the fact that he said that this is tougher to memorize than Shakespeare. I'm going to go ahead and disagree with that.
Yeah, the
I
enjambment.
think this is much easier.
I think he says something like the enjambment. I couldn't memorize it because of the enjambment.
Yeah, but the rhyme of Shakespeare, that makes it so much easier to remember. Forget about, the complexity of the language that he was using. This is hard. So now that we're done pitying, the young ninth grade Ben Lerner who says that he chose to memorize this poem by Marianne Moore instead of Shakespeare like his other classmates. He did this for a class. So when we're done pitying him, we get into this discussion about what this poem is for him. Not so much what it means, but, I guess his personal truth about like the poem and like what it's saying, or find some way to connect it to the argument that ultimately he will make. Right? He says, what kind of art assumes the dislike of its audience, and what kind of artist aligns herself with that dislike, even encourages it? Yeah. An art hated from without and within. What kind of art has a condition of its possibility, a perfect contempt? And then, even reading contemptuously, you don't even achieve the genuine. I don't feel like we ever at any point get a clear determination of what exactly the genuine is.
Yeah, that's what one of my questions was, okay, what is the genuine here?
I can only align it with what he will later define as the virtual, or, capital P poetry.
Right.
And we'll get into this very shortly, I'm sure.
And what you just read there on page 5 is kind of like what I called the assumption that Lerner uses to kind of go off from, to kind of like, he uses this assumption to, frame the essay, essentially. But yeah, I take a few issues with the framing. One being, okay, what is the genuine? How does one judge it? What does it look like? An example, anything, right? Give me something to actually talk about. And you'll hear me do this, listeners, as we go through this episode here, because what I took what I kind of found grating about reading this was the vagueness, the kind of dancing around what I think is an actual point, but just not managing to nail it down. And things like that, like, okay, well then what's the genuine? The other thing I have here on page 5 was just like when he calls it just a few lines down, and this is where I brought that question about, is poetry dead? Because he says on page 5 here, every few years an essay appears in a mainstream periodical denouncing poetry or proclaiming its death, usually blaming existing poets for the relative marginalization of the art. And then, defenses light up the blogosphere before the culture, if we can call it a culture. There's blah, blah, blah. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is that's definitely the central theme, right? This, whole denunciation versus defense of poetry, the hatred of poetry versus the love of poetry, right? Which, we're reading into that I too dislike it. And, the part about reading it with a perfect contempt for it, which contempt here is probably a little bit closer to hatred than dislike. But whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I just don't think that, I feel like there's just like this weird shift in this moment, right? From this like weird jump from talking about Marianne Moore's poem to, poetry overall as being something defined by both a hatred of and love for, or by both a denunciation and a defense. But he sort of, throughout the essay, seems to like put these, it sort of starts out as situated like the hatred and love of poetry comes out of the same person or from the same place, right? But then we talk about various denunciations and defenses of poetry, and those frequently come from very different places, right? From very different writers. And I just don't think that he actually talks about what the hatred of poetry is, or certainly like what the dislike of certain poetry is, and definitely not in the context of Moore's poem.
Well, that's what I think he tries to right after, where he's just like, okay, the blaming existing poets for the relative marginalization of the art, right? Like, whenever you hear these articles either defending or denouncing, like, you could throw defending in here too, because like I said, I just mentioned those articles that I saw just over the last 5-6 years, just coming out of normal places like the Times and stuff. Marginalization of the art. My question is, all right, what is that? It's not popular, doesn't sell books, people turn their nose up to it.
The so-called marginalization, it's not central to our culture. Like, people aren't, poets aren't famous except to other poets, right?
That, and I think he makes a good
that's
point.
How it goes.
Yeah, and he makes a good point, kind of trying to elaborate, I think, a little later on, where he talks about this kind of imagined, importance that we said, oh, historically it used to have importance or something. It's like, well, I mean, these people were born, you know, in the 20th century. Like, it's not like they know that, like, oh, yeah, a time when, like, most of the population of the world couldn't read. Yeah, it was just such a big, powerful art form. Like, everybody was consuming it. Yeah, okay. So I grant that, yeah, that's a good point he makes, where it's like, it is this imagined kind of, if you're relying on that to make an argument about why poetry is dead or unimportant, or, you know, what Lerner appears to be arguing against, if you're using this kind of historical relativism kind of thing, it's going to be a weak argument. And I think he rightfully calls that out kind of in this later on, not in these first couple pages.
I think what
but
he's
yeah.
actually saying is that there are only as many readers of poetry as there are writers of it. People frequently get offended by that.
Well, this is what Grossman said. You sent me that Grossman quote, right? He said there are more practitioners than there are readers of this art form.
Like, just saying, like, yeah, that's okay. Like, no one ever is just like, yeah, that's fine. Like, I think what frustrates people is their so-called dislike of individual poems. And you know, there's plenty to be said about individual poems in the context of Lerner's essay, but
Right.
yeah, so, like, I don't know, we get this sort of idea about, you know, a rhythm of denunciation and defense, as he goes on to say on page 6. Yeah, I mean, I said, like, well, you know, what does this actually mean? Does it mean that the growth of its practice, but, like, not of its readership, like, you know, may ignite this, like, semi-constant urge to defend the art to a largely unread public? Like, I don't, or like that as poets, you know, maybe, and I think this is maybe a more honest point, that we're, like, constantly fascinated by or concerned with the art of poetry. Like that, you know, there's this constant searching for purpose of the practice.
Yeah. I take issue with that quote where he says, yeah, what kind of art is defined, has been defined for millennia by such a rhythm of denunciation and defense. I'm just kind of like, is that what defines the art?
It isn't like
Right,
that.
yeah.
You, like, I mean, and this is the problem we'll come back to with everything, and, like, we can sort of ignore everything I just said because I'm like, I don't even care about it now. But like, the problem is that it feels non-specific. Like, you could say this of many forms of art, right?
So,
like, it doesn't just have to be poetry.
he says it has been defined for millennia by such a rhythm of denunciation and defense.
Millennia.
So again, that's a very lofty claim, and I just highlighted that. My little thing next to it was, is it?
Well, he does. I mean, he goes back to Plato.
Is it defined by that?
Right.
And if so, how so? You know, like, gotta give us something here, man. If you're gonna make this claim, like, I'm all for it, but, like,
Yeah.
you gotta give us something. Like, is it this? How did you come to this conclusion that like, you know, this art is defined by such a rhythm of denunciation and defense?
I mean, you could just say that that's, like, the entire, like, that's just true of art.
Yeah, I mean,
Like, whenever something happens in any art, you know, there are people who are going to praise it and there are people that are going to defend it. And, like, you know, that was the second big issue with this first piece of the essay, is that I was initially intrigued by this because I was also very interested in, like, you know, why do we need to defend poetry every so often? Like, why do we keep seeing these articles come up?
right. And try to convince us how popular and important and vital poetry is,
or how dead it is.
Yeah, or how dead.
And, like,
opposite.
and especially, like, and I'm also very interested in, like, the idea of poetry's audience and, like, you know, what that actually means and who poetry is for. Not in some, like, exclusionary way, just, like, who as a poet like does one presume to be the audience versus like who is the actual audience.
Right.
Yeah, so I I think those things are all really interesting, but we also just don't get anything that feels very, I don't want to say concrete because I don't think that's right. But like almost feel like you could have gotten rid of the whole thing about Marianne Moore and just made this essay more clearly about like, how do we follow this sort of cycle of denunciation, defense, and like what does that actually mean? I think that almost would have been a little bit clearer and more interesting from the jump instead of giving us a story about ninth grade and your fascination with Marianne Moore and then ultimately giving us a reading of Marianne Moore that I don't really understand.
Yeah. I think this stems from, again, my bigger issue, and this is what I always bring up, is I think his argument stems from this problem of romanticizing the art to a level that can't be achieved, and I think that's what he's trying to say, but at the same time he's kind of romanticizing it to that level, so like he's not actually proving.
He does it in the next pages when he starts to talk about when he talks about Cadman
and Grossman
and Bede, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he gives us Grossman's interpretation, right? So like, we get this. I don't really care that much to talk about Bede right now. If you really want to know, look it up. Cadman's Hymn is like one of, I think, the first poems that we have record of in the English language, maybe. Yeah. Or maybe it wasn't like written in the English language, or I don't fucking remember. I learned this forever ago. But yeah, he talks about that, and he talks about sort of this transcendental calling, right?
Yeah, what he says
the transcendental impulse, and like creates this image of a sort of like poet mystic almost.
That's what I mean. It's this kind of romanticizing into abstraction that I don't find that useful. But the bottom of page 7 into page 8, where skipping over the Catamon shit, yeah, that was where he just says, bottom of page 7 here, before going into page 8, poetry arises from the desire, and I think this is from Grossman, right? He said he's pirating Grossman here, yeah, an abstract.
Yeah.
Poetry arises from the desire to get beyond the finite and the historical, the human world of violence and difference, and to reach the transcendent or divine. And right away, I'm just like, okay, reach the transcendent or divine. Like right away we're going into abstraction. Right away we're going to something that's going to be so difficult to define and talk about that we're probably not going to get anywhere. My thing was is that like, he gives us this from Grossman, but doesn't do more than the kind of like religious prayer like fervor of poets past. Like this is like what it is, right? Oh, a poem is so sacred, it's hard to even talk about, right? The transcendent and divine. Like he's talking about these huge fucking things. And I get what he's trying to hint at.
The calling is more transcendent than the actual art, right? Like being that's fair. What he's getting at, I think, is that like in a dream, your verses can defeat time. Your words can shake off the history of their usage. You can represent what can't be represented, right? But when you wake, when you rejoin your friends around the fire, you're back in the human world with its inflexible laws and logic. So he's like, defining a sort of transcendental thing, right? Like isn't, and this is what he's going to establish throughout this entire essay, that there's, the poem, there's actual poems, and then there's this thing that is capital P poetry, right? Like there is essentially the idea and the thing, right? He gets very, very Plato on us. And it's just kind of, I don't know. I feel like you could have won me over, like at least partially, if you had eased me into this.
I think
with a
it.
little more discussion of the defense and denunciation. If you like really built something there and then gave us this, maybe. But that's when we get, you know, the poet is a tragic figure, and the poem is always a record of failure.
Yeah, I don't I really have a hard time understanding this tendency in an argument such as this to make poetry even more romanticized to the point that it's otherworldly, right? That as if it isn't a man-made thing, like as if it isn't,
Well,
people
it's
just
it's
wrote
so
this.
fucking otherworldly. It's so fucking otherworldly that when it enters the real world, when it becomes a poem, and this is sort of Lerner's explanation, right? What he's going to go on to explain as the virtual versus the actual, which he steals from Grossman. And like and this Alan Grossman, he taught at the Johns Hopkins MFA for a good long time before it was an MFA. It was,
The writing
a creative writing
seminars,
MA
yeah.
and all this stuff. Yeah. Really, really loved by his students and all of this shit. And for good reason. I mean, I've read him. He's fucking brilliant.
Yeah.
He is way smarter than I am. Like, I mean, he's the kind of writer who you read knowing that you won't understand and like very much aspire to, but know that you have to read 8 times and, you know, with a bunch of other references in order to be able to even begin to understand, which, I'm sure many people would say, well, that means that it's like, is it actually that smart or that good? And I would say, well, like, probably not just by virtue of those things, right?
Yeah.
But
I like
because
Grossman.
typically, like, when, yeah, I mean, like, you just know that he's smart. He's just one of those, right?
I like Grossman for the same reason when we talked about Bloom on our Bloom episode, where it was just he's incredibly serious. He takes this very seriously, and he's very careful, articulate, like desperately trying
Very
to.
genuine.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. Oh, there's that word, genuine, dude. The genuine, the real. We talked to honesty last episode. Honesty. These words that people throw out,
Yeah.
and like when we talk about writing specifically, and it's I'd like it to be a little bit more rigorous than what I currently read and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, you mentioned
Well,
that.
maybe it's that he's also very, very well read, right? And
Right.
another thing that you feel in both, like, in someone like Alan Grossman or someone like Harold Bloom, who, while is a, controversial figure, you know that when you are reading him, that he is like very studied and that he knows his shit and that you feel comfortable trusting, um, a lot of his breakdowns of like a poem, even like if you were just look interested in understanding Whitman, right? uh, Bloom is a great place to go, whether or not you agree with his particular positions on the canon or whatever. You can sort of trust him to have a pretty solid understanding of Whitman. So yeah, I mean, Grossman is not someone that you can just so easily, like, even I not understanding all of what I've read of Grossman felt very uncertain of his borrowing of Grossman's terms, just because I was like, I don't know, like his everything that he explains feels more complicated than this and more nuanced than this, and this feels all too easy.
Well, we plan to, listeners, at the end of this, go over kind of a response or rebuttal essay by Holiday, kind of a bitchy essay by Holiday.
Yeah,
So,
it's definitely a bitchy essay, but Halliday is kind of
but he
bitchy,
does,
but also was sort of, he knows Grossman, he knew Grossman. He
uh,
pretty famously had a book length conversation with Grossman that you can buy called The Sighted Singer.
that, and I think one of the things Holiday attacks Lerner for in that is that he says uh, he misuses Grossman. He says he's not fleshing out like Grossman's careful nuance when he's making these distinctions. But the thing I took an issue with in this one you just mentioned, right? So thus the poet is a tragic figure. The poem is always a record of failure. My
Ugh,
the poem is always a record of failure. Again, for somebody who's so careful with their words, this is a very
it's not
lofty
just a
claim.
failure.
This is
It's not just a failure, it's a record of it. Which, like, okay, I guess, I mean, yeah, that's still kind of, it's careful for what he's trying to say. It says exactly what he's trying to say.
Well, is always a
It is,
record of
but it's a
failure.
lofty claim.
Well, that's what I mean. So he didn't say most, he didn't say often, he said always a record of failure. Now, we don't need to nitpick over
Yeah,
that one word, but I was just saying, is that true? Do we agree with that claim? Because this is a pretty broad
no.
claim. Yeah, I don't agree with it
I
either.
mean, okay, like, someone, listen, the right person could walk me down this rabbit hole, and maybe that makes me a piece of shit for just like not trusting in this particular explanation. I'm sure that you could make some argument. I'm sure that like, most poems will have some part of it, right? That does not line up with the original vision. But like, do we care upon reading the poem
Well,
um,
my bigger issue in
that
terms of
is like a beautiful, wonderful poem that is celebrated over and over again, whether or not the intention of the author is precisely executed?
well, for me, my question is, we
Or do
both,
we assume it is because it's good?
since we both say that, like, yeah, we don't think it's always a record of failure, and this is something Holiday gets into too, where he's just like, what? I can name you a bunch of great poems that don't fail, and he starts naming them, you know. But like my bigger problem with this is if I was to write a defense of poetry like Lerner's trying to do here, why frame it this way? Like why diminish the art like this while defending it? I think he's doing it
Uh,
because it makes it easier to defend when you just say, "Oh, well, it's all a failure." Didn't you know all poems are always a record of failure? Like, and I'm just like, it diminishes the art form. Like he's
and maybe
diminishing
he
it.
just like put out a book that didn't do that well.
Well, yeah. I mean, you could argue Lerner. I mean, nobody really knew about Lerner until his novels, or celebrated him at least with those fellowships. But still, I mean, that doesn't neither here nor there. I'm just like, I feel like for somebody to frame it this way is to diminish the art itself, and of course, when you diminish it, that makes it easier than to write a thing. Oh, well,
Well,
poetry
that's what
doesn't matter. It's all just a record
well,
of
it's just
failure.
yeah, it's easy because no matter what you fail, right? So
Right.
there it sort of even later when he talks about a bad poem and references what Wikipedia I guess calls um the worst poem in the English language or something like that. Even then it feels like he levels the field, right? There is no longer this great distance between the greatest poems and like even mediocre or like the worst poems,
Well, that's what I mean. I think it's a
right?
dishonest portrayal. I think he's being a little disingenuous about that framing. And granted, like I can see why he's saying it, of course, because it makes it easier to argue for what he's saying here. But like, it's not actually grappling with like the issue where it's like, well, yeah,
Well, yeah, I
most
don't think it ever
poems,
actually does. I don't think
yeah,
it ever actually grapples with the distinction between what we would celebrate as really good poetry and what makes poetry, stick around and what poems tend to fall away. And maybe that's because a lot of what has tended to fall away has done just that.
yeah.
Um, but he also like, yeah,
I take problem with this. Well, it's all just a record of failure, so it doesn't really matter. And I'm just that's such a cop out to me. Like
well,
that's
he
such a
doesn't say it doesn't really matter, but it does. It is like this sweeping claim that sort of paints over, you know, the edges that would define like, what we would call really good poetry from what
right
we would call really, kind of shitty poetry.
because I am
And I'm sure
sympathetic.
there are plenty of people who would I like and I've heard people say, there is no good and bad poetry, right? These are not usually like poets that I hear
Yeah,
this from.
yeah. Well, that's what I mean.
But
I'm sympathetic to it because I agree that yeah, most poems are a record of failure. Most are like 99%. Like
yeah,
yeah, but I think
even of good poets.
I
right?
think by
Like,
taking that, well, yeah, I mean, nobody can write a masterpiece every single time, but that's, I think, taking that framework of ignoring that 1% of what we would call great or non failing poems, in Lerner's words, poems that succeed, I guess, instead of fail. Like, not acknowledging that, I think, is a weakness in this argument, because it's like, okay, if you're not going to acknowledge that there are poems that I would call, or that what I would say are not failures, then you're kind of diminishing the entire point of the art. Like, you're kind of ignoring the entire point of the art, and that's kind of my. I'll keep bringing this up as we go through this book here, but it's like he keeps kind of doing that. Like, he keeps kind of diminishing the art form in order to make this kind of, I would call, easy claim. It's easy to say shit. You say whatever you want.
yeah, I mean, like he says a lot of shit on page 9 too. I mean, okay, like he goes on to talk about,
Yeah, let's get to the actual and virtual.
should
yeah.
you get the should you get the book, right? You can find his discussion of the virtual and the actual beginnings probably on page 8, about halfway down. Right where we left off, the poem is always a record of failure. There is an undecidable conflict between the poet's desire to sing an alternative world and, as Grossman puts it, the resistance to alternative making inherent in the materials of which any world must be composed. Okay, that's a mouthful. It's a lot. But essentially, I think if we're like going to dumb this down to like be where we need it to be for Lerner's purposes, is this essentially just between the desire for what the poet wants language to be and what it actually does? Or is this the difference between what we hope for, or what our ambition is, and what our actual abilities can accomplish? Like, I'm not ever fully sure of that in this whole essay.
Yeah, I took a little bit of issue with the singing metaphor.
I mean, this whole paragraph I take issue with, just because it's so, for such a densely worded thing, like in this otherwise really casually put together, or I don't know, like this essay feels sort of casual. It all like alternates between being like personal and then jumping into sort of historical references, right? It goes back and forth.
It kind of flirts with making a point. Yeah. Well, my problem, the sing, the poet's desire to sing an alternative world. Again, that's a framing that I'm kind of like, is that the poet's desire? Alternative world?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's like he means the transcendental, right? Like I assume that's what he means. That's all I can assume he means, right? Is this like transcendent desire and the, inability of language to adequately capture that. But he then says, so that was essentially, some of that was Grossman saying, so resistance to alternative making inherent in the materials of which any world must be composed. So by virtue of being, in the real world, we are not like, transcendent beings. I don't know. What would you call it? But yeah, I don't even know. I don't feel smart enough to unpack that all the way. But that's what I think that's what I think Lerner is saying. And he talks about Grossman's idea of the virtual poem, what we might call poetry with a capital P, he says, right? The abstract potential of the medium. And that is as opposed to the actual poem, which necessarily betrays that impulse when it joins the world of representation. I was like, the world of representation, like I took issue with that too, but
Well,
you
that's
know,
what I mean, because it's not
almost.
actually dealing with the reality of it. It's abstracting it to the point of, I would say, nonsense. But that's why I hate this kind of like, oh, when the poet, by the poet
Well,
when
then,
called
because
upon
the
to sing.
world's the world of representation, or
Yeah.
like the medium of poetry is the world of
Right.
representation. Like,
Or the
I don't know.
medium of
I get like
poetry
hung
representing
up.
something from the world of representation.
Yeah, I get hung up on like how to exactly understand like what certain things are, like the world of fucking representation in this essay. And
And
of course, we are in the within the first 10 pages of this 86-page essay, so you know, I was sort of having a hard time with like the first chunk of this book.
yeah, listeners, it
Um,
doesn't get much better from there on out. But my issue with the singing metaphor, the poet singing, is this when you're called to sing. I just can't stand this when you're defending an art form. So you're defending this art form, or at least that's what the title would imply. I think that's how this book is kind of
Saying I'm called upon to sing is probably not the best defense if you're looking to
right.
like get newbies to come and
And
join up ranks.
and it's not so much because it's being like lofty or an idealist, it's because it's another art form. So singing is an entirely different art form than poetry, although
Well, okay.
I mean it is
Yeah, it
though.
is, but like they're so closely tied and so like often referenced together historically that like that doesn't bother me.
It just
What
bothers me that like
bothers me is the
we
more romantic aspect of it without sort of what feels to me like a more like a meatier substance behind it.
yeah, and like I'll grant that too. It bothers me because it's just like, is poetry so weak it needs another art form to prop it up in metaphor to explain it? It's just kind of like, and yeah, I grant the fact, okay, yeah, if poetry kind of came out of song initially, sure. I just, you know, I don't think it's the same art form.
Yeah.
But
I
yeah,
mean, it was originally an oral tradition, right?
sure,
Um, Rhyming was used to, help us memorize stories as we
sure,
told them, hence the epic.
sure.
But you're moved to write a poem, you feel called upon to sing because of that transcendent impulse. Um, yeah, I mean, like there are just so many words that we could strike from here, like transcendent, for example, or you know, the entire you feel called upon to sing, right? You're moved to write a poem because of the impulse. There's some impulse in you to make something with language. Like that it would be adequate for me,
Right. Well, that's what I always
right?
say too, and I think people do this. They use music maybe because music is such an old art form, like basically since the existence of time, right? Like we've had music, or what you could call music, argue is music, singing, chanting, whatever it is. That's why I always said I
Well,
use
I
the
think
example.
poetry, yeah.
And I texted you this with the example where it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, you took a film, sure, film came out of theater, and you could argue theater came out of poetry, sure, but like, film and theater are not the same art form at all. Like they're related, they overlap in
Yeah.
places, but it's entirely different.
Yeah,
Like
I
it's
mean, I
not
think it's the form that qualities of music for generally, it doesn't have to be
right.
singing, but the qualities of music, I think, are maybe the most easily or like closely related to the qualities of poetry,
Yeah,
if we had to pick one.
my entire thing with that is just a personal issue I have with the use of it. So take that with a grain of salt, listeners. But I think we do need to nail down this
Yeah.
actual versus virtual. That because Lerner
Yeah,
refers
and
to
I
this
think
throughout the whole thing. So I mean, we just like I was when I first read this, I was like, "What the fuck is he talking about?" So I guess
it's
virtual.
so,
Yeah, what's
yeah,
virtual?
go on.
Let's try to define. So I would say
It's just
virtual is
it's
the
so literally, I think it's the idea of the thing,
right,
right?
the
It's
abstract
something
potential, the
idealized.
right,
Yeah.
the
You have in your
imagination.
mind the idea that you are going to create this poem and it has this magic and this beauty, and then you go to write it down and it's a sack of garbage. And that is the difference, friends, between the virtual and the actual. Um, but yeah, the virtual could be read as the idea, and the actual could be read as the thing itself.
So
right?
the actual is the realized, or what he would call representation of the virtual, or the abstract kind of potential or inspiration for a poem.
Yeah, it's theory versus practice.
Right. Or you could argue craft versus, yeah, abstract potential or inspiration theory. But yeah, okay, so if we're going to nail that down, he then goes on, if not a genuine poem, no such thing. And again, we have no idea what he
Yeah.
means by genuine here. He's just claiming that there's no such
What
thing
the
as a
fuck
genuine
does
poem.
that mean?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know. This is one of the ones that made me the most frustrated because I was like, what is the definition of genuine? Like, is virtual synonymous here? Like,
Right.
in that it, like, I just don't understand. I can only understand what genuine is here. I mean, the references to the genuine, quote unquote, in Moore's poem, right?
Yeah.
A place for the genuine, right? I too dislike it, reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it. One discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Again, friends, harder to memorize than Shakespeare,
But that's what he says.
says Lerner.
Yeah, on page 9, if not a genuine poem, no such thing, a place for the genuine, whatever that might mean. So again, like he's just giving us this. He's not even trying to.
He doesn't know what it means.
Right, that's what I mean. It's like, well, if you don't know what it means, how the fuck can you argue for this? Like, if you can't define
At least
it.
not for another however many pages. He doesn't seem to know what it means.
And
Or he
then-
doesn't give us what it means.
Yeah, so it's good that we broke that down because listeners, if you read this or if you're just using our talking about this as an excuse to not read it, he does come back to this actual versus virtual to kind of explain his position, and it kind of hinges on this kind of broad abstraction that he uses here. But I take even further issue on page 9, just below that, where he talks about, why Grossman speaks to him. But he's like so many poets, I live in a space between what I am moved to do and what I can do, and confront in that disconnect not only my individual limitations, but also the structure of the art as I conceive it. And my whole thing with that was just like, this is every art form. Like, that's true for every art form. Like, you know what I mean? The fuck was that?
I just figured out that I could react with these like dumb emoji things.
God, dude, emojis should just be wiped off the face of the earth. That's my take
So
on emojis.
I gave you this clapping guy.
Yeah.
Good job.
But I was just like, this is every art form. Of course, the artist, writer, whatever you want to call it, of course they're stuck in this place between, what you want to do, and then the limits of what you can actually do personally, and then also what the craft and structure allows you to do, right? This is where we kind of get to the limitations.
That's unfortunately the sad chasm between ambition and talent.
Not
We all
even
experience it.
But I mean, that's literally
Or taste and talent.
That's literally the art form. Like, he's just describing the art form, like every art form that exists.
That's what a lot of this is. It's just describing the art form.
Yeah, like he's just describing
what poetry is.
Yeah. Not only that, this is just describing the actions of like, okay, if I'm trying to create art, well, this is what you're doing. You're living between this space where, you have inspiration and then what you can actually achieve. So if you're just starting out, your inspiration is never going to be what you wanted on the page. The whole point is to use the limitations to actually do something with it, I would argue. But yeah, that's again another just little aside that I have with his kind of, he makes a lot of these kind of just throwing them in there. And this is why I kind of say, like, it's not almost an argumentative essay. It's more of like just a personal reflection. He just kind of throws these lofty claims in here and just is like, yeah, just deal with that, reader. Just deal with that claim.
Yeah. And actually, can we pause for a second so I can go grab a battery?
Yeah.
But the next thing I have is the dentist story. I don't know if you want to keep that or skip it and go like...
What page is the dentist story?
I believe 11. Okay. So
I'm almost there. I have
10 to 11.
Few things I want to talk about where he kind of, I don't know. Yeah. He kind of talks about feelings.
Does some bullshit.
Yeah.
Talks about his feelings.
Yeah.
Okay, give me 1 second to grab a battery.
Yeah,
Sorry, I was also sweating balls and I had to
is
fucking change.
your heat still broken?
No, I'm just fucking sweaty as shit. I'm a sweaty person. I've just had so much under tit sweat.
Yeah. Before we move on to the the dentist, it's like a Seinfeld episode. No, all right. Uh, I do take on page 10 there. I have another issue with this. Where, again, he keeps diminishing the art. I feel like he keeps diminishing what poetry is in order to be able to make this claim. I feel like, and that's my biggest problem with this whole book. I'll keep saying it this whole fucking episode. But on page 10, when he talks about the bitterness of poetic logic is particularly astringent because we were taught at an early age that we are all poets simply by virtue of being human. And I'm just like, dude, like you keep broadening and broadening, not just what a poem is, what a poet is, what the art form is. Like, and this hurts. This makes it so that he's making an incoherent argument, in my opinion, on this thing. Again, it requires this kind of decoupling from, again, romanticizing the art into oblivion, essentially. But I just have this.
Well, it's worth noting. It's worth noting here that this claim comes about as a product of the whole "you're a poet and you didn't even know it" phrase. So that, like the one that you say to children.
That's what I wrote in my notes. I said, this is a child's understanding of poetry. Like, this is a child's understanding of the art. This idea that we have feelings inside of us, and that's what helps make us poets.
And we all continue to believe that as we grow older,
right.
that by virtue of being people.
Yeah, and I think, and I used to see this in grad school where like you ask younger writers, people that are just getting into it, right? They're interested, they maybe want to take it a little further, go to grad school, all that kind of stuff. And it's always what I see, young, inexperienced writers making this claim. It's a feeling, right? Like they don't even know how to talk about this art form because it's just a feeling they feel. And I get that. I'll grant that, when you like a poem, it's an inherent feeling inside you, like this kind of being, we talked about this on the Bloom episode too, right? This kind of felt change, he called it, right? Like this feeling that grows inside of you. And I get that's your response, right? That's important. And that's important when you're close reading, talking about something, making a judgment on something, all of that. But I just feel like it's so simplistic. I mean, it's like a child's understanding of this, and it's being held up as this great.
Well, yeah, and we never talk here about how if it's good, which is, on the one hand, that's also seemingly not the argument he's trying to make, but it is also not clear up front, right? That we're not going to get there.
Well, I think the fatal flaw,
like, because it doesn't become entirely clear. Like, it isn't until maybe like halfway through reading the thing that you're like, okay, so like we clearly are going to keep coming back to this idea of defending or denouncing poetry. And that is ultimately like what he's trying to create a thesis around, which I think is fine. Like, I think, that's largely interesting, even if it's not executed in exactly the way that I would like.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's when we get these moments of like, these claims about what the nature of poetry is without ever really talking about why any one poem has this particular power. And maybe like maybe it's not about like the power that an individual poem can have, but like this power of the abstract idea of poetry. And I think that is maybe more what he's talking about throughout this whole essay. And like, if he would just start with like a subtitle that's just like the idea of poetry, I feel like that would put us on the right track.
I mean, for context, in this section, he's not even talking about poetry. He's talking about just like what drives a poet, essentially. And again, I think he's diminishing that, but he's really broadening this to where he says, "You're a poet." And this is the bottom of page 10. "You're a poet, however, whether or not you know it, because to be part of a linguistic community, to be hailed as a you at all, is to be endowed with poetic capacity." I get what he's saying. I get what he means, that you have to start from this place of feelings in order to even compose or understand a poem. Sure. I get that, but he's just saying that like this equation, like he equates it with this individual, like just being an individual who has feelings makes you like a poetic capacity. I get that. I understand the intention behind it and the meaning behind it, but I'm just like, this is not a helpful way to talk about the art form or the practitioners of that art form. Like, it's just, you keep diminishing what it is these practitioners do and what the art does by saying, oh, if you're just a person with feelings, you know, you're a poet and you don't know it. Kind of stupid shit. Like, again, this is childish almost. Like, I can't believe this is held up as some type of great lofty ideal. I can't believe it. But I mean, again, I can believe it because, again, poetry's dead, right? Like,
well, so yeah, he goes from that, right, to talking about his dentist and like, oh, like having someone like your dentist ask you
quickly,
like,
before
are you're a poet?
Before we go to dentist,
Go on.
he says, because to be part of a linguistic community. What is linguistic community? I was just like, what is that? What is a linguistic community? A shared language?
Assume that's just, yeah. That's all I can read that.
Anybody who speaks English? Anybody who can read and understand English, even if you can't speak it? Right. It's dramatic. It's overly dramatic. Yeah. It's like, it's very... I'll say it's very like internet dramatic, like this kind of like hyperbolic exaggeration in order to make a point, and I just think it's weak. Like he said, on the next page in 11, he says, the ghost of that romantic conjunction makes the falling away from poetry a falling away from the pure potentiality of being human. And I'm just like, oh, dramatic much? That is very dramatic. Like, you're being dramatic as fuck, dude. And this is when he gets to, of being an actual person in a concrete historical situation. Your hands in my mouth. Like, okay, dude, you're being very dramatic. Yeah, go to this dentist.
Yeah, he talks about the dentist and, like, you know, it feels like a defense of the embarrassed poet a little bit, right?
Exactly, that's what it is. Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's, you know, that on the one hand, everybody has this capacity to be a poet, but then, you know, when it comes to actually being a poet, there's a sense of embarrassment. And, you know, if someone asks you, like, oh, like, what do you do? And you're like, I'm a poet. It's like there's something uncomfortable there. And like, I mean, I assume that's largely because, like, you know, you like poetry and you also know that most people do not, right? Like, most people that you probably encounter, like, just in your day-to-day life, if you are not somebody who's teaching in an MFA program, like, you know, or whatever, are not going to be people who are like, oh yeah, I too love poetry. And then worse than that is asking, like, oh, are you a published poet? You know, like, that's the only really true measure of whether or not you're a poet. And I think Lerner also knows that this isn't true, right? Like, but understands also that, like, and this, I agree with him, right? Like, there's, you know, like, this weird, like, you know, a public knowledge that, you know, well, if you are of any value, then you must have been published. You must be read by other people, right? Or else you are not really a poet, are you? And he says, everybody can write a poem, but has your poetry, the distillation of your innermost being, been found authentic and intelligible by others? A readership? And he talks about the, quote, bafflingly persistent association of poetry and fame, and says no poets are famous among the general population.
Which is true.
Right. So, you know, he sort of touches on, like, who actually reads poetry, who the audience of poetry actually is. And none of this is actually like, he doesn't treat this as at all really as being about audience, right? But about this idea of what a poet is, to the poet.
Right, which is why I would call this more of a personal kind of reflective essay than anything else, than more of like an argumentative. But he makes that claim again on page 12. There is no genuine poetry. There is only, after all, and at best, a place for it. I'm not entirely sure what that means. And again, he really doesn't give us a lot of more offering in this. There is no genuine poetry. Does that mean there's no honest poetry? There's no real poetry, authentic, as Bloom would say? It's like, what does that mean? There is no
Yeah,
genuine poetry. What? How can you make that claim and then not tell us what it is? Like, and I guess
the
people
only
could
way I
argue
can
he
read it
tells
is
us
that
what it
there
is.
is.
You could argue,
I
yeah, say it.
can only read it as synonymous with virtual poetry. Like
Which
the idea of
is
poetry
right,
is the
so which
only
is something
genuine
that doesn't
poetry.
exist, like which is poetry that isn't in existence. So it's like this,
Not tangibly.
yeah, it's this. Well, it doesn't, because I mean, if we're just gonna say, oh, every moment of inspiration is poetry, again, that is so broad as to be
Yeah.
meaningless. Like, it's not. There is no genuine poetry. I don't know what the fuck he's talking about. Like, and I guess, yeah, if I'm trying to understand what he's saying, if I'm really trying to, okay, give him the benefit of the doubt, what does he mean by genuine? He means pure potentiality of being human, like something like that. Like, these lofty kind of ideals that people just repeat. And I always struggle with this, because I'm like, wait a minute, what are we saying when we say something like there is no genuine poetry? Like, and why would you want to argue that in the first place if you're trying to argue for people to love poetry? Like, again, you're diminishing it to say you should love it because it's like doesn't actually matter, or it's not actually genuine, or it's never going to be, it's all failure, you know? So you shouldn't be mean about it. You shouldn't make a judgment that's going to hurt somebody's feelings or make somebody disagree with you, whatever it is. I don't know. I don't know. I guess I should move away from that, because he keeps coming back up, and I don't need to mention every instance of him bringing it back up.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that we can only read it as being, or at least I and I am open to, alternative readings of this, but if we're to assume that he gets the word genuine for more, right? And he sort of situates it around this idea of the virtual and the actual, and like I can only assume that the genuine, I don't know, like maybe I'm not saying this clearly, and maybe it's because I don't fucking understand it.
But I
I
think,
feel like I have very little to cling to there.
well, that's what I mean. He doesn't give us that. And if you're going to write something and you're going to call it the hatred of poetry, and you're going to have a Guggenheim, and you're going to have all this stuff that like makes everybody listen to you about it, I just expected a little bit more rigor if you're going to make a claim like this, not just like a personal reflection on craft. But he gets to this too. Another thing that he says on page 13, where he says, he says, this isn't the only way to think about it, or that everybody's not going to think about this to the same degree, or that it's the best way of thinking about poetry. But I am convinced that the embarrassment or suspicion or anger that is often palpable in such meetings derives from this sense of poetry's tremendous social stakes. Sense of poetry's tremendous social stakes. And I was just like, what is that? Again, it's this lofty claim, claiming that everybody hates poetry, but it also has tremendous social stakes. I don't know how you square those two when you're trying to seriously write about this, which again would lead me to believe that he's not seriously trying to write about this. But we can't make assumptions about that. But yeah, so
Where is this?
This is on top of page 13. The sentence kind of starts at the bottom of 12, but second line in page 13, where he's talking, the assumptions about present poetry are present for everyone, and he's saying this is one of the assumptions, that this sense of poetry's tremendous social stakes. And I just don't know what those tremendous social stakes are. I don't know what he means by it. He doesn't offer a clarification. He just says that poetry, the thing that nobody reads, it has tremendous social stakes. Like I said, I think it's the kind of claim you can only make if you only interact with people in those kind of circles, like academic, Harper's, New Yorker reading, kind of people that give out MacArthur and Guggenheim fellowships type of thing. You know what I mean? Like, you can only make that assumption and think that it makes sense if you already romanticize this thing beyond what it actually is. So yeah, I don't know what the social stakes are for what we would call poetry, or what those.
Well, yeah, he says that poetry denotes an impossible demand, right? And I want to go back a little bit and see if we can unpack this. All right. whenever we think of particular poems, poetry is a word for the meeting place of the private and the public, the internal and the external. My capacity to express myself poetically and to comprehend such expressions is a fundamental qualification for social recognition. So this is where he's like talking about the like need to be recognized as like a poet, but specifically as a published poet, right? Like as sort of the need to be acknowledged as like existing, I guess.
Right.
Right. He goes back to that phrase of like, yeah, I'm a poet and you know it now, right? He talks about getting all of these people who like yeah, on the next page he talks about having been the editor for a small magazine and getting all of these submissions from like people who he says had clearly never read the publication. So I'm assuming we're really not familiar with what kinds of work they accepted, but whose quote cover letters expressed a remarkable desperation to have their poems printed anywhere. Some of these letters, tens of them, explained that the poet in question was suffering from a terminal condition and needed to see his or her poems published before he or she died.
Yeah. It's funny to me that people actually do that in cover letters, but of course, why wouldn't they, right?
Yeah, and he says, I'm not mocking these poets. I'm offering them as examples of the strength of the implicit connection between poetry and the social recognition of the poet's humanity. So here he's, I think, when we get this right before that, when he's talking about the sense of poetry's tremendous social stakes, right? Even though it maybe isn't hashed out here just quite enough yet. I think he maybe means to discuss poetry as what Grossman calls sort of like the person making power of poetry, or the presence making power of poetry. I don't remember word for word. But yeah, the appearance of a person, right? It's sort of that is how he talks about a central power of poetry.
Well, he doesn't say this.
Right.
He doesn't say this because, again, I think this entire argument is confused, and therefore Lerner's confused. But what he's talking about here is this idea that there's a reverence around poetry, and he kind of glosses over that as he calls it hatred. But there's like just an inherent reverence when you mention poetry, when you mention you're a poet. People just do this automatic kind of referential, oh, that must be important, right? Like he mentions the reading of poems at weddings, things like that. That's when people break out poems, all that kind of stuff, because we hold this kind of reverence around it. And I think I just think he's glossing over one of the huge points here, is that it is this kind of referential. It's like, I'm trying to think of an example of like somebody in charge. We just give them kind of reverence to.
Well, I think it's also, I also think that maybe there's this thing that is common in, among people who read, even, right? We've seen this all over the place with people who just say, I don't understand it. It seems too difficult. It's too much work. I don't want to read it. Which is like fucking fine. If you're not like a teacher in an MFA program, in which case I would argue it's probably not fine. And for the sake of your own reputation among your students, maybe get a little bit familiar, because if you were one of those teachers who said that to me, I probably judged you very harshly.
Yeah. It's this. They say it's difficult because it is, like when you learn about it in school. I think this is what he's getting at and not saying. Either he's purposely ignoring this, or he is just straight up ignorant to this, or just doesn't understand what he's saying. So it's like, okay, we're taught that it's this difficult thing, right? That it's this thing that high-minded, lofty ideals exist in, right? That's what we're taught. We're taught that from a very young age, and that's what people experience poetry as. One, because it does require active reading, if you want to call it that, right? Like active engagement with the reader. People don't want to do that. They want to passively enjoy something. They want to just have it wash over
Yeah,
them.
poetry makes demands of a reader.
Right, exactly. There's
Right?
that. So that's one of the things that's kind of inherent in this. Oh, this is one thing that's harder to read than a novel, or harder to read than, like, an article or something like that. Therefore, people just associate it with this kind of reverence, like, oh, that's beyond me. Therefore, it's kind of reverent, or I mean, I don't want to use the word sacred, but it's kind of the same type of thing, right? I don't know. And he uses
Yeah,
that
also,
example.
like,
Go for it. Yeah, sorry.
reading it's just not that popular. And, like, if it's not that popular among, you know, 18 to 25-year-olds, chances are, like, you're not first gonna dip a toe in. For the most part, most people probably not gonna, like, suddenly get into it, like, age 40,
Yeah.
right? Like, so yeah, like most of your peers, unless you exist in like a sort of small community, or if you've like sort of kept friends through your life who are like avid readers or writers or probably both of poetry, um, yeah, they're not gonna recognize your name even if you are relatively well known, right? Like I can
Yeah.
name so many pretty well known poets to people I know who are very avid readers and mostly read fiction and often literary fiction and have no idea who a lot of poets are. Very famous ones.
Yeah, and I think this also it kind of plays into his thesis of, he would say there's no genuine poetry. I would just say that most people don't get anything out of it, right? Like most people are passive fans of art. And on page 16, he gives that example of, if you admit that you're a poet on a plane, or like waiting for a flight or something, just talking to somebody sitting next to you on a bus, they will often ask you, and when you were foolish enough to this is on page 16, and when you were foolish enough to identify yourself as a poet, your interlocutor will often ask you to name your favorite poets. You give a couple examples. Then he says, the person will squint as if searching his memory and nods as if he can almost recall the work in the name, even though, of course, he can't. None of the hundreds of non-poet acquaintances who have asked you this sort of question ever can. And he said, but I've decided, and I'm deciding as I write, that I accept that look, that I value it. I love that the non-poet is conditioned to believe that the name and work are almost within reach, and even though the only poems he's encountered in the last few decades have been at weddings and funerals. I love how it seems like he's on the verge of recalling a specific line before he slowly shakes his head and concedes, I've never heard of him or her, doesn't ring a bell.
Or it's like being polite and trying to like engage you.
Well, that's what I mean.
Know?
When I read that thing, I was just like, this is true for every art form, though. Like, this is just polite conversation, and he's trying to extrapolate this kind of, oh, people hate poetry. It's like, nah, dude, if I started rattling off indie bands to somebody, it said I was a musician and I'm in an indie band or whatever, and started rattling, just non-top 40 artists, nobody would know who I'm talking about, okay? Like, it's a normal reaction because most people are just passive consumers of art. Like, they're not these, like, most people have a terrible taste in music because they're not actually, like, avid music fans. They just kind of passively listen to whatever's played to them on the radio, right? Like, this is the same thing for every art form. Most people have a terrible taste in movies because they don't actually care that much about engaging with it, right? They just want to passively enjoy it and then move on and be like, it made me feel excited when it blew up, That's all they get, right? Same thing for poetry, but he's trying to make the claim that poetry is very specific about it, blah, 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 and people will pretend to see movies when you bring them up. People will pretend to have read books when you bring them up, like most academics do when you mention something like Moby Dick or whatever.
Dude.
Yeah, like it's not, like this is just it's a human thing.
Or like, if not that, pretend to be interested in reading it. Like, right? Like, I mean... which is like so common, and like we have all done that, and like I'm sure that a lot of my initial interaction with reading actual poetry was a phase of pretending to be interested in something I largely had yet to understand. And through the familiarity that I, came to acquire over time with it, was
Right.
how I began to understand and love it.
Yeah.
Right? There are poems that you can hate and then you read them 12 times and you end up liking them. And the same, it's a matter of familiarity. Hang on, I'm gonna grab juice real quick.
Yeah.
Am I making a point at all, or am I just like on some random fucking tangent? I feel like I start making, like I start having an idea and then, see, I actually think I am exactly like Ben Lerner in a lot of ways, and that I feel like this just reminds me of my undergrad thesis,
Are you much afraid?
except more successful,
Yeah.
which is really sad. It's really depressing.
Yeah, and this is I guess that's why I appreciated kind of Holiday's takedown is he's a little kind of snarky about it, and I'll get into how I feel about internet snark and how it's kind of invading everything. But yeah, I think he kind of takes that down very well with a little of this, I don't
Yeah,
know.
what are
It's
what are the
childish
big
epiphanies, yeah. Things that are known, but you're
since we're
pretending that there's some type of epiphany. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Or things that are known
Now,
and normal.
since we're at an hour and a half and we're on page 16, do you want to briefly discuss which points we definitely want to go over? Because I definitely have a bunch of pages of notes, and I know that I should skip some of them.
Well, I mean, I didn't mention or mark anything else in my notes till page 25. If you just want to keep moving along.
Okay. I wouldn't mind doing like a quick overview of what he says next because I think he just gives a number of historical defenses and denunciations of poetry, right? So we sort of shift back to that argument. He talks about Plato. Essentially, he talks about, so he was talking about sort of the social power of poetry, right? And he goes on to say, to talk about Plato and his sort of desire to exile the poet, right?
Yeah, I dismissed all the
And
Plato
that
shit.
there's this power of poetry implied by Plato's idea that, poets have no place in democratic society. And then goes on to say, Plato might be read as a defense of capital P poetry from poems, right? Yeah, he talks about Sir Philip Sidney's defense of poesy. He talks about the genre of defending poetry, which I think we could have maybe opened with a lot sooner. Again, this is where I feel like he's actually trying to get at something.
We're gonna keep saying it. This could have
And he
been a
does,
great kind of defense, like an overview of all the recent articles, or just a couple historical
well,
ones
it
through
doesn't have
time
to even be a
periods.
defense. I think it could be a really interesting, just uh, sort of study of these historical denunciations and defenses of poetry and
Right,
see what he can parse from that
and it's an interesting
instead of sort of
topic.
trying to pull in Marianne Moore, which he maybe could have done, but maybe not as sort of the upfront kind of tagline.
Right. Well, I would always say, well,
Um,
because that requires a lot of work, dude. If somebody were to put a book like that together, I mean, that would take years of research, thinking,
Well, and he
rewriting,
makes sure that that he didn't want to do that because he talks about
because it's too much work. Yeah.
yeah, he
And he's
talks
already got
about
his million
his
dollars.
admittedly desultory reading in my admittedly desultory way across the centuries. I have come to believe that a large part of the appeal of the defense as a genre is that it is itself a kind of virtual poetry.
Yeah.
It allows you to describe the virtues of poetry without having to write poems that have succumbed to the bitterness of the actual. Um, yeah, so yeah.
The Plato stuff disinterested me so much, I was almost disgusted by it and just didn't take any notes on it.
I mean, I just again yeah, I don't know. I was just curious to see who, in the places where he chose to reference historical figures or particular poets, uh, I was really interested to read those bits and how he sort of squared them with his own ideas. Um, but yeah, so he sort of says, yeah, I'm kind of like reading casually, but I've, you know, this sort of defense as a genre allows us to engage with this like capital P or virtual poetry or the idea of poetry without having to deal with the failure of actual poetry, which I think is true. I think to call the genre itself poetry in any way is kind of silly.
Right.
Unless like at that point you're just it's like, okay, a lyric essay, sure. Fine. To say that but yeah, like to say, okay, it allows you a way to engage with the idea of poetry without having to actually like write a failing poem on,
Right.
yourself. Yeah, that's accurate. It just takes it, I think, a step too far by trying to say it itself is, you know, an attempt at poetry in any way.
Yeah. On page 25, it's the same thing. These ideas just get expanded on as we go through, where he says, page 25, last sentence in that first paragraph. When we experience a poem's radical failure, we must be measuring it against some ideal, some poem. And I'm sympathetic. This is my adults like I'm sympathetic to the idea of measuring against an ideal. I think that's true, right? Like that's what we're doing. But I think he glances over this or attributes it to some mystical humanness or something where it's like, and I think again the holiday essay that we get into, he kind of takes him to task for this, where he's just like, are we comparing it against some imaginary ideal? Are we comparing it against what we would consider to be exquisite poems, like exquisite examples?
Like,
Like it's
where
not
does this
yeah.
where does this idea of this like perfect idea of like the perfect poem, where does that come from? Is it just like this thing that came out of nowhere from like your weird transcendent impulse, or did it come from somewhere because you have at some point in your life been forced to encounter like Shakespeare?
And I think he's granting this, right? He's like, we must be measuring it against some ideal, some poem. And it's like, yes, like we are. Right? Like, isn't that, like, that's what I mean. This kind of becomes like, not even like the hatred of poetry, it just becomes like a hatred of judgment. Like he's saying, oh, you're not allowed to judge this because otherwise.
Well, and even if you do, it's your judgment of it that allows you to engage with this virtual poetry, this capital P poetry, this, transcendent, otherworldly, mystical, intangible thing, right? That even, and he says something that's relatively smart, I think, that like, some of the most ambitious poems, when they fail, have the greatest echo of like their possibility, but it's like because they fail so wildly. Right.
Right.
Because they lack in craft or in skill, what they might have in ambition.
Yeah.
But he leans into this ideal rather than the fact that there is probably some poem that realistically most people like have encountered. Like if you decide at some point that you're going to write poetry as, even like as a teenager or as like a young adult, whatever, like chances are it was either because you were like writing some emo shit in your diary or because like you encountered something, and it might be it's like something lame. All right, I'm not going to tell you what's lame. I know it was lame for me. All right. But like because you encountered like whatever was going to be your sort of beginner poems, right? Whatever was going
Yeah.
to like initiate that interest for you. Whatever it is. And it might just be like, I mean, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just like writing some bullshit in your diary. But I think for most people who choose to stay in that world as they continue to get older, probably have actual poems that they actually measure themselves against.
Yeah. Well, this is where we get, because it is subjective right here, but I'm just, yeah, I mean, the solution to having, like, all art forms are subjective judging. I mean, the Olympics, all that kind of stuff is happening. Like, all those, there's just, I mean, there's some events that are straight up like, okay, timing, like it's a race, right? But then the other events are just like the dance events, the skating events, like, those are judged by a panel of subjective people. Like, that judgment is so important to be able to compare this to what we would hold as an ideal, or if it's not an ideal, which I would argue it's not, could argue that like what Holiday does is point to specific things that say, no, this is not a failure. Look at it. Like, this is what we're comparing it to. This specific thing. Like, that's what we're comparing it to. And, it talks about meals, right? When we say, oh, that food wasn't that good, it's like, yeah, because some food is exquisite and then other food is just okay, right? Some food is terrible. Like, it's just what it is. So I don't like this idea of using the fact that it's just an attempt, or that it's just like, unmeasurable, unconscious kind of virtual thing in our heads is the same thing as like this. Like, I think it's just a disingenuous comparison to make a point on that. But yeah, I don't know. Fucking Ben Lerner. My next thing, I think page 30. I don't know, did you have anything else on that?
No.
He keeps saying this, defeat time.
Yeah.
Transcend representation and defeat time.
Yeah, I mean, well, he just means, and I think that we see echoes of this everywhere, and it's not a new idea at all, is that, to write anything, especially if you're trying to publish something, is like, an attempt at some kind of immortality. You can say that of like any kind of fame.
Is that what he's talking about?
I think so.
The kind of, being
Maybe.
remembered? Because he mentioned it before in the beginning.
Or to like, is it just this whole, mystical otherworldliness thing?
I'm not entirely sure, because I would say the logical.
It would help if we had some example poems.
Right, it's
which
all
he only has
evidence-free,
one.
yeah.
It is admittedly well, he has a couple, and one of them is admittedly one of the worst poems that anyone could choose to discuss.
Imply a poem that could transcend representation and defeat time. And then he says the demand I'm making of McGonagall is impossible.
Yeah.
And I'm just
this is again like, right? Because poetry is impossible, right? That's his, little refrain. Poetry is impossible. Actual poems are not, but they always fail because they are not virtual poems.
And because they're impossible.
They are not the idea of the poem, because that is impossible to accomplish on paper.
Like I said, I just
Which
don't...
is just like, it's just an unhelpful,
Right.
it just feels like such an unhelpful argument for understanding poetry.
Well, because it is. Like, it's... I don't understand that transcend representation and defeat time. Because I think he's trying to use defeat time as something more than just like being remembered or having something.
Well, he talks about Keats here too, right? And the same way that Keats talks about like he talks about Ode to a Grecian Urn and says literary form cannot actually produce the higher music Keats imagines, right? It can only figure it, which is, in a sense, what McGonagall manages to do by being so bad. So we're talking about McGonagall's, William Topaz McGonagall's The Tay Bridge Disaster, of whom Lerner says his ambition outpaces his ability, which is what I guess he tells us makes the terribleness of the poem so palpably felt, and the distance and quote, the distance between the virtual and the actual so palpable. But compares it to Keats, right? Like, yeah, he's just trying to take a bad poem and a really good, or like a poem that is cherished by many, and talk about how they both gesture toward the same thing. They both gesture toward this, what he would call, or like, virtual. And he uses the word virtuality, or like virtualizing, to talk about, what poets do in poems. He talks about this with Dickinson, which I actually would, I don't agree with his terms very much, but I agree that, the way that he talks about the way that she uses the dash and how it sort of, is a space for like this unsayable thing, right? Which, again, I don't agree with the terms that he uses, but like, that there's like a gesture there that isn't easily put into language, I would agree with, right? There is like a silence there, but I think you can talk about that in a way that is, it's just like he makes a statement about all three of these poets, right? He says they make a place for the genuine by producing a negative image of the ideal poem we cannot write in time. So for McGonagall, it's writing a poem that is so bad that you can only see the ambition behind it, right? And how it fails. And in that, it shows us an image of, what it was attempting to be, the virtual thing that it attempted to be but failed to be.
Like I said, this is so abstract.
With Keats, but I mean, like, that's what he's trying to say, it seems like.
I mean,
right? So he's talking about poetry as the possibility of poetry, not as actual poems, which is like the thing that I come back to that's really frustrating.
Yeah. Well, that's my whole thing, where it's like he's using time. So he's using this thing to defeat time, and he's using that a couple different ways, because a couple pages later he talks about suspending time. And I'm just like, dude, what the fuck are you saying, dude? Like what the fuck is this saying?
I think that...
Like, time is a very fucking... like,
he just fails to adequately talk about the experience of reading poetry. Of actually, like, feeling connected to what poetry is and does, and like how you know when a poem succeeds and how you know when a poem fails, except I guess all poems fail, so why bother talking about it?
I think it's telling that he doesn't mention Bloom or quote Bloom at all about what he's trying to talk about.
Yeah, he does. He talks about Plato. He talks about who else does he talk about? Oppen. He talks about that shitty book of the best bad verse.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, why are you reading that? Yeah. I mean, he talks about, we're still on the Tay Bridge disaster. I haven't changed pages in a while.
What page are you on?
What page? I'm on 37.
For me, what did you say on page 37?
Oh, it was the last thing that I was talking about on 37 is, so he talks about, these three poets and how they make a place for the genuine, which again he does not define, by producing a negative image of the ideal poem we cannot write in time. Yeah, and he goes back to this language of, I mean, his whole essay just uses the language of Moore and of Grossman. And in Moore's case, I'm like just constantly kind of confused by it, right? I too dislike it. This is at the bottom of 37 and on to 38. That too in the Moore is important. Poet and reader of poetry are united in a suspicion of the song that any quote earthly poet and that suspicion is the ground for an intuition of the ideal. The hatred of poetry is internal to the art because it is the task of the poet and poetry reader to use the heat of that hatred to burn the actual off the virtual like fog.
Yeah, dude. I highlighted that and I was like, that's quite a claim to make without backing it up. Like, is that true? Do we agree with that?
It's quite,
Does it?
I mean, it's just like such a mouthful. Because poet and reader of poetry united in a suspicion of the song of any earthly poet. I mean, I would agree on that first piece, right? We're all suspicious of or I am, I think that as poets, we sometimes make very lofty claims. I think this is where, Ben Lerner is maybe like true to the nature of like what poets tend to do, right? Like we will say things in poems that just as though they are true, which are often just not necessarily entirely true. Right? I think that happens a lot.
Yeah.
And that suspicion is the ground for an intuition of the ideal. So that by being suspicious, we have this idea that there must be some ideal truth or like some other more true thing, more genuine thing, right? I mean, I think what he's actually saying is that there's like an idea that it's not good enough.
Yeah.
That this poem and this statement or whatever it is I'm writing in this moment is just not good enough. And I, the poet, know that, and you, the reader, are suspicious of that. We are united in our suspicion that I am not adequate.
So,
Is that what we're saying?
What he's calling hatred in this sense is judgment, right? Like that's what
I think the hatred of poetry is something else. I think this is how we judge poems. I think people who like claim they hate poetry don't actually. They just don't want to engage with it, which is different.
Exactly.
I think that
it's indifference.
The hatred of poetry is different than the hatred of individual poems, which is also not discussed at any length.
Yeah, and Holiday says this in his article too, where he says, I think what Ben Lerner means by hatred in most cases is indifference. I mean, like, it's not like these people, I hate it. I hate it. It's like, do you know how much energy it takes to hate something? Like, this is why I'm like, I mean...
Yeah.
This is why we make fun of haters online.
Poets who hate individual poems. The people who most hate poetry are poets.
Yeah.
Right? Like the people that most dislike, or at least I think, like, the people who I talk to when I read a poem and I'm just like, no, this isn't for me, but feel the need to share it. I'm going to share it with someone who I know also writes poems.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is the point in the essay where I was pretty frustrated.
Not always. Sometimes it's bad to share with my family.
Yeah, I was pretty frustrated with the essay at this point, and then I think it kind of just devolves from here, where then he starts getting into, again, the fervor of 2016, all that kind of stuff, like the stuff that was in the air, right? Everybody was talking about...
Yeah, white male nostalgia.
White male nostalgia, yeah.
Something that you said.
The white
one
male.
Particular critic.
Dude, the white male hated himself. Yeah.
Yeah, he cites one denunciation. He talks a lot about Whitman here and Whitman's sort of, democratic project So he
Dude,
calls it,
the
right?
claims about Whitman, I've been telling you this whole week. I've been reading this and texting you. The claims about Whitman, I thought were egregiously out of left field. I don't know how he got a lot of these claims. And again,
Well,
it's
some of them
because
are crazy. Just like, I mean, he makes some claim at some point about how the way that, and like, you can follow this statement, like, it's fine, right? There's
right,
no way. And this is something, again, that like I would have done that I think poets tend to do. Like, we get excited, we think like metaphor, yes, right? And it turns out that to just like actually be a little bit obnoxious to most readers. That like, um, and maybe it was my frustration at certain moments by this point, because again, Lerner is smart and he dances around something that is a point that ultimately I think he gets to, even if he doesn't make it that effectively. I think he's really intelligent and maybe, in places too much so for like, too much so for his own good. Um, but
it's the same thing. It's this
yeah,
projection.
he says this thing about Whitman and his lines and how they're so long and they're always running over the right margin as a kind of virtualizing his poetry. And I was like, is it, or is it like a disruption of what was the dominant craft of that moment?
Well, yeah,
But
again,
yeah,
it's this same thing I said when we talked about Bloom is like I see a lot of this in especially when I talk about like poetry scholarship. It's this forcing what I would call kind of unprovable projections onto like we're asking the art form to do more than it's capable of doing, and we're just like pretending that's not the case. Like we're just pretending that it's capable of doing whatever we want it to do, which okay, I'm sympathetic. Some places maybe it is, right? Maybe we can do that. That's part of the art form, sure. But like
I
when
think
he
we're just trying to be nice.
well that, and I think like when he makes claims like the most immediate and fastest, like the power of the art is the most immediate and fastest way to achieve socio-political reform. I just like I don't know how you can make that claim. Like, can you give me an
Yeah,
example
does
of
he
when a
actually make
yeah
that claim? Where does he make that claim?
page 39
What page are you?
page
Yeah, so is he actually making that claim or is it like a
it's
hypothetical of some kind?
it's in
I don't
reference.
remember,
It's when he's talking about the theory of
but I
the avant.
remember thinking like,
Yeah, it's when he's talking about
oh
the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
avant-garde
Okay.
and how it's kind of tied to political action when it came about and all that kind of stuff. Sure, all that, but I'm waiting for something for like what did the avant-garde do? Like, did it create like any type of what you would call sociopolitical in air quote reforms? Like, did that happen? I mean,
Has any single poem ever?
yeah, well, that's what I mean. I just, you can tie that to, okay, we could argue that the sentiment of the poem had an impact on people. Maybe it changed somebody's minds who read it, maybe something like that. But to say that the poem did anything like that is just such a stretch. And I think, again, it's going into the unprovable realm here. It's just a nice sentiment to think about. It's just something nice to say, like you said. It's just being nice, kind of. I don't know. I don't agree with it at all. I don't see any evidence to say that this art form, or really, I would argue movies, you could make that argument for more than poetry, in terms of you could have literally trace historical kind of changes in public sentiment if you wanted to even go more open than socio-political reform, just public sentiment, like how people think of things, whatever it
Yeah.
is.
I
So you
mean,
could,
my feelings on this is that like whenever you talk about like poetry as a form of resistance, I'm like, to whom?
right?
Like
Yeah.
to other poets? Are you resisting? Like, who is this readership that this is going to have such a profound impact on such a massive portion of society as to demand sociopolitical
Yeah.
change as a result of a poem? I also feel like that's maybe a little bit self-aggrandizing.
Right.
But like not of, I don't think necessarily of Lerner, of himself, right? But like of the poets who propose that as their central project by way of poetry. This is what we intend to do. To which I would say there are probably more direct avenues to what you are trying to do. But whatever, and I would also say, like, I think Lerner does have humility here. I think that he knows that this is sort of like, as much as many parts of this essay might be a mouthful, as much as we might disagree with it, there is humility here. There is something of an awareness here, right? I hope it goes without saying. He says that my summary here doesn't pretend to be comprehensive. Poems can fulfill any number of ambitions other than the ones I'm describing. And this is on page 76. They can actually be funny or lovely or offer solace or courage or inspiration to certain audiences at certain times. They can play a role in constituting a community, and so on. The admitted weakness in the story I'm telling about poetry is that it doesn't have much to say about good poems in all their variety. It's much better at dealing with great or horrible instances of the art.
Yeah. For me, it's...
But I don't know that it deals with, like, either of those, actually.
Right.
I think it's trying to deal with ideas about the art more generally, and with that comes the risk of saying something that applies broadly to just art generally, which I think in some ways he's done. I do think it's interesting, and maybe it's just because of our particular level of exposure to poetry and this particular form of art that we see these defenses and denunciations come around again and again. So I don't know how much of that happens elsewhere.
Well,
although I assume it does.
And I think he kind of, and that's the point too, about halfway through this, he kind of glances over something. I understand why he glances over it, like kind of just brushes off of it, but he doesn't do that. He tries to make it something else. Like, it's uncouth to say this, especially in academia, but I think he's mistaking a lot of the hatred, or what he's calling hatred, of poetry, particularly by critics, when he starts quoting critics and stuff. He's not mentioning that it isn't hatred of poetry, but it's this very human kind of bitterness and jealousy on the person criticizing, right? And he uses that example of the inauguration poem, I guess, with like Obama's inauguration. There's Packer, some poet or critic, I've never heard of it, but he's like, quotes him about, he wrote something about how he didn't like the poet that, Obama picked for his inauguration or whatever.
Well, he didn't like that there would be an inaugural poem.
Right.
He didn't like the idea that there would be a poem written specifically for this occasion, which, like, on the one hand, I almost agree with, because I'm like, you're writing the one thing, like, is it going to be good? How much time do you really have? Like, whatever. It's for a much more general audience, and we don't need it to be the poem. And I think maybe, like, asserting that that's some kind of crime, some kind of art crime, is maybe silly.
Well, for me, it's more of...
that's like...
He's, again, you're not... I understand why he doesn't say this, because it is kind of like, ooh, you don't say this in polite company, i.e. academia. You don't say this. But, like, everything I read that he quoted from that critic that was saying, I guess, Alexander was the poet that was chosen. This was before I was old enough to even fucking know I liked poetry. So I have no memory of any of this shit. So it's like, but when I read the quotes from that critic being like, oh, this isn't, how do you get, we shouldn't have an inaugural poet. Every time I read the quotes that Lerner put in this book, I was just thinking, I was like, yeah, what this guy's saying, like Packer or whoever Lerner's quoting, is he's just pissed it wasn't him selected to be the inaugural poet. Like, that's what I kept getting out of it, because he's not making an argument that makes sense to me. Like, oh, it doesn't capture enough. Oh, it's not a good poem. It's a bad practice. I was like, nah, dude, you just wish it was you selected. Okay, that's what you wish. So you get that bump in book sales. All right. We all know this. You're not supposed to say it, but like, that's really what he's calling hatred, is this kind of natural jealousy, neuroticism that like comes when you're trying to do something that not everybody gets to do. It doesn't even matter if you're good or not, right? Not everybody gets to do it. This is and I was like, I appreciate his point that he's making with that, but I think he makes the wrong point. He calls that like Packer wants the poet to be a poetic ideal. I was like, nah, dude, you're over intellectualizing this. This guy's just bitter as fuck that he wasn't selected to be the inaugural poet
That
for
he
this.
didn't get the
Yeah, for this
job that comes with the
historical,
most
the most historic inauguration we've had in our, like in America. Like, he's just pissed he wasn't selected to do it, right? Like, I think that explains it more than this. Oh, he's complaining about a lofty ideal that isn't met. It's a much simpler explanation, at least in my opinion. But yeah.
Yeah, and for reference, this is let's see, what's the first name? So the critic is George Packer.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter, dude. It's just, yeah, Packer wrote some bitter fucking thing because he wasn't selected, and we're pretending.
Elizabeth Alexander, yeah.
We're pretending.
Elizabeth Alexander was the poet.
Yeah, we're pretending that he had some legit criticism or something. It's like, nah, dude.
Yeah, well, he says, for many decades, American poetry has been a private activity written by few people and read by few people, lacking the language, rhythm, emotion, and thought that could move large numbers of people in large public settings, which just sounds like a poetry reading. And I'm like, what? Like, okay, tell us about what it used to be like then. Go for it.
Right.
Like,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, exactly.
what do you,
right.
you know, what are we asking of the poetry reading here? Like, what are we, I don't know. I think you're right. I think my initial response to that quote was actually like, yeah, I agree. But then I was also like, but not really, actually. Yeah. Like, yeah, you're going to the inauguration or you're watching the inauguration. You probably care enough to watch the inaugural poet, right? Yeah. Like, I don't know. I just don't think that actually matters that much. Yeah. And, whatever. But he really starts to sum up around page 76. Where he talks about sort of the weakness of his story that he's telling about, capital P poetry. And it's kind of pleading a little bit. He says, but the story is illuminating because, whatever he says, which I always think is kind of funny when someone accounts for their own story. It's illuminating. Yeah. And it's like, you have now told me that the epiphany of this story was specifically for you, which is fine. Like, that's fine.
Yeah, and that's right before that. I mean, that's when he goes into the he just starts making claim after claim about Whitman.
Yeah, so he makes a lot of lofty claims in here that he keeps on saying perfect contempt, which at some point he describes, but I just don't really agree with his description of what, he calls perfect contempt. Maybe I should. And this again comes from Moore's poem that he cites at the very beginning. But he talks about Alan Grossman dying. He died in 2014. He died that summer. That's sort of just like a momentary intermission right before he, just sort of right before he closes in the last 10 pages and talks about sort of the childlike nature of playing with language and all of this other stuff. And yeah, I was kind of worn out by the time I got here, gotta admit.
Dude, that Whitman stuff threw me for a loop. I had to stop when I was reading this and just put it down because I was like, what are you saying, dude? Like, I get the sentiment. I get it was at a time where there was turmoil, uncertainty. Everybody freaked out, like 2015, 2016. But, like, he's stretching. I mean, I think that's why people like the book. This is what people took from it, was that he's comparing these kind of...
It's so flexible.
Right. Like, he's making just wild claims. Like, at one point he says, Whitman democratizes pronouns and then says he makes I and you universal. And I was just thinking to myself, like, dude, so the I and you were not universal until Whitman? I just, and again, there's no evidence, doesn't say why this is. It's just a lofty claim that kind of goes along with the sentiments everybody was feeling.
He talks about the sort of democratic ideal of Whitman and being the everyman and wanting to stand in for the everyman, right? Whether or not he actually succeeded at that, I think, is a different argument to be making. But then we get this story at the very, very end. I think maybe one of your favorites from this essay about when Lerner attended a, quote, aggressively mediocre opera.
His opera.
And his boredom, he was bored, and he says it deepened into something like a trance. I happened to see from our distant seats a single firefly slowly flashing around the orchestra, then floating onto the stage, then drifting back beyond the proscenium. Is that the right way to say that? I don't fucking know. But yeah, I happened to see from our distant seats a single firefly slowly flashing around the orchestra. And it goes on, and he says that its light appearing here in New Mexico, and then 3 leagues from Seville. Like, like all this stuff, he just talks about, what is this firefly story about?
Again, I mean, it's the same thing. It's just abstracting further what he was already
Here
saying.
in clock time, and there in the continuous present tense of art.
Right.
Like, if we were going to talk about the present tense of art, I feel like we had to talk about that sooner, maybe. But yeah, sure.
Well, I think that's where it really falls off the rails, when he starts trying to make these connections between...
That's where...
Well, I mean, before then, I think I wrote in my notes here, it really falls off the rails halfway.
Just throughout.
Yeah, this essay falls off the rails when he kind of, like, the intent to prove hatred is so lost in his defense of all this, like, kind of what I would call his contemporaries for the most part, that he kind of dances around the point he's trying to make. And I think it just further obscures it, right? Like, he's not really making a case for why people hate poetry so much as he's making a case for why he believes it to be.
No, he never says why people hate poetry. I don't think it's ever actually said. Any of the, multiple reasons I think that exist or are common for disliking at least poetry, which I think is probably a more common attitude than outright hatred. If he's talking about hatred, maybe, like, is he actually talking about the critics? Is that who hates poetry, the people who denounce it, not just general readers? Because I also don't think that's what Moore's poem is about, which is also one of the big, problems I took with the setup of this essay, is that I wasn't convinced by his reading of Marianne Moore.
Right.
And again, like, I think he's smart. Like, I do.
At the end of this book, I don't think he's so smart. Yeah. By the time I got
he
to
says
the
at the end, all I ask the haters, and I too am one.
Where is this?
Is that they strive to perfect their contempt. Even consider bringing it to bear on poems where it will be deepened, not dispelled, and where, by creating a place for possibility and present absences, like unheard melodies, it might come to resemble love. So I think, like, what he's talking about here is familiarity. In some sense, right? That to perfect your hatred for something is to actually understand it and understand why you actually hate it. And then in the process of doing so, you recognize what it is that, or maybe it's just like actually recognizing what it is about other poems that you do love that are absent from this poem. But love is a big word to throw in there by the end, right?
Yeah, well, it's because if you use these...
I think he alludes to this idea up front, but I don't think it actually gets said at all or, fleshed out in any way. It gets said right here.
What page?
This is the very last page, 86.
You're already on the last page.
Yeah. Yeah, the paragraph I read was the last paragraph.
Oh, okay. Do you want to touch on the nostalgia he mentions? So I think that's where
Oh
he
man,
makes this. What?
oh man, go for it.
Well, I just think that's where he makes a good point. Where I think he makes this point where he's making a point that I think does like delegitimizes his entire argument, right? Where he's like, nostalgists want this ideal. He's describing an ideal, like he's arguing for this ideal that doesn't exist, right? And he's not being very rigorous about it. And I mean, I agree with the claim that, yeah, nostalgists are looking for something that they wrongly assume existed years ago. I agree with that. I think that's correct, right? When we feel nostalgia, we're just kind of projecting something onto it. But I just, yeah, he's making,
Yeah.
he undermined his own claim because he's projecting an ideal here, especially when he starts talking about, this, he gets into these weird capitalism metaphors and all this kind of, and I get, these are buzzwords. These are trendy. These are things that were on trend at the time,
Yeah.
still on trend.
This is all very, very sexy, but it was like all so sexy. Failure was really sexy in this moment.
Right.
Like just failing as a good thing was a really hot thing that was going around.
That's what I mean. And like, and using that example, I think, this is why I say, oh, maybe he's not so smart, because by using this framework of nostalgia, which I agree with the framework he's putting forth, he's falling victim to what he accuses them of. Like,
yeah, well, I also think it's like just one of the things that you can fall victim to if you're trying to wrap in so many abstract ideas into one thing without a clear and obvious goal. I think that maybe if his goal was just to understand why we frequently feel the need to defend or denounce poetry, I think, again, like maybe these ideas would have wrapped in more naturally, but it just felt maybe like it drifted focus here and there and like couldn't stay in.
It drifts focus from the very beginning. Why does it drift focus? I would argue because it's not very well thought out. I mean, I don't think he put much rigor into this. I think that's why I would call this a personal reflective essay, because that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is like a personal essay that maybe would appear in like his personal collection of craft essays.
Yeah, I think it could have been broken. It would have made more sense if it was broken into multiple essays too, but
100%.
Yeah, because he
100%.
jumps around so much. One thing I wanted to draw attention to, and this gets back to the, who are these things for? Who is poetry for? All this kind of stuff. He says, he tells this story. What is this? This is page 77. And, he says, that I'm not pretending to have my summary here be comprehensive. Poems can fulfill a number of ambitions other than the ones I'm describing. Again, removing his own authority in this sense. So that's fine. But I guess that's what people want to see. But he just says...
Yeah, but it's humility after making so many fucking massive claims. Right, so, I don't know.
Of course you have to backtrack those. Yeah.
This is,
of course you have to backtrack because they crumble under like a shred of scrutiny kind of thing. But he says, the story is illuminating because it helps account for the persistent, if mutable, feeling that our moments' poems are always already failing us. And my question here is just, who is the us? Who are these poems failing? Is it America?
Yeah.
Humanity? Ben Lerner?
We don't get that answer, do we?
No. Again, because it's an abstraction. It's this broad abstraction that you can project anything on. So he takes it towards the kind of...
It can only be those of us who read poems, I assume.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, you could say that. But I just mean like fail. So somebody writes a bad poem or a poem that he would say fails us, right? Who is us? What has it done? Like I write bad poems every day. Like nobody like, I mean, it doesn't affect anybody, right? Like who is...
Well, by his own understanding, it can only be readers of poetry who are largely other poets. Right? Like he says that so many times in different words.
But I think he's going broader than that. I think he means it broader than that, like failing us.
Failing society, failing humanity.
And I think it's kind of reveals, I mean,
they have some great purpose.
We went over this a little bit. I think it's kind of, you can kind of see Lerner's insecurities in the fact that he's Ivory Tower. He's a poster boy of the Ivory Tower. I mean, this guy's got $1 million worth of fellowships in his back pocket. I mean, I don't. I mean, of course he is one of the most celebrated contemporary writers in existence. There's like a deep insecurity where
Well,
he's
and is
talking
he not
about.
more celebrated as a fiction writer?
Well, he
I
is.
mean,
Yeah, he is. Yeah. Like I said,
I mean, like I knew him also first as a fiction author
yeah.
before I knew him as a poet.
Well, me too, because his fiction made some waves. His poetry never made any waves. So
Well, we also like don't, but I don't think I was like in any serious way interested or like exposed maybe to the world of poetry when he was first putting books out.
yeah,
And I didn't encounter those until his novels were introduced to me.
yeah. I just again, it's this pretending that poems are doing something other than just being like an art. Like I know why, I understand the impulse to romanticize art and say that it's doing things that it couldn't possibly, even in the wildest realms, be doing. But like when it says it's failing us, I'm just like, really? Like again,
Yeah,
like
well, I
it's
don't even feel like he's established any way in which it's supposed to actually. I mean, the only way that he's really established it serves us is what? That it m makes us present to one another. It literally,
yeah.
like, it gives the appearance of persons to one another.
Right.
It's hard to unpack, and I think maybe it's, a little bit muddled, and I think that maybe by the end there are some moments that are reaching that maybe feel like a nice bow to put on it but don't quite make sense. So yeah, I think that as like the reason why maybe this is frustrating is because it is like more of a personal reflective essay than it is one of like a personal I mean, I guess it's his personal theory or his personal application of a couple of theories.
Right.
But yeah, it does make a lot of claims that it doesn't back up and then says, hold up, I know I didn't back this stuff up, but
But
let me
believe
just
me,
assert
yeah.
really quickly that that poetry is failing us.
And I think his example of the hypermart and that, like, where he's talking about, like, again, this kind of capitalism metaphor, I think it's much weaker than he thinks it is. Like, you
I
know,
would be interested in the argument that about how poetry is failing us because I
right,
don't see him like, and
right.
his whole thing is that like you can't have a love of poetry without the hatred of it,
Well,
right?
yeah,
Or
and I
that
think,
can't have you can have a perfect contempt for it and also find that you have love for it, and that these qualities are, in his words, inextricable from one another.
yeah, and I'm kind of disappointed too because Ben Lerner's at a place in his career, like to do this type of argument, to do this in a way that I think we're holding him to, that we would like to see or are interested in, or originally thought this was going to go in that direction. To do that, you got to burn some bridges. If you're going to do this honestly, you're going to lose some friends, kind of thing, because you're going to have to talk about kind of like, I don't know, you're going to have to bash some people's dreams and lofty ideals, whatever you want to call it, right? And I just, because Lerner's in a position where he could do that
Well,
and
you
get
just
away with
might
it.
have to say things that like people don't agree with,
Well, that
but
too, yeah. You have to
also
make a judgment.
in
Yeah,
what capacity is like, yeah, to say that poetry is in some way failing us, I think you have to, you know, unless I mean, he's been saying that this whole time though, that all poems fail,
which you and
right?
I have said we kind of
All
fundamentally
poems
disagree with, but yeah.
we do. So is this just like a playful poetry is failing us?
Right. I
Like, is this just playful?
I
Um,
I don't think it's playful at all, dude. I mean, at this point I have to believe what he's saying, right? Like, I mean, is this just a joke? Like, why would he write this if it was just playful? But I mean, that's the thing too, right? Like, there's no seriousness. It's like you could pretend to be serious about poetry and people just praise you anyway. But I just mean my point about that was like, he's in a position. Like, there are no more prestigious fellowships for him to even get awarded at this point. Like, he's got them all. He's got the professorship, the full professorship at a college with tenure and all that entails. He could have done something like what we're saying. He could have made that argument with the judgments and people would get mad at him, etc., etc. But again, he's Ben Lerner, so what's they gonna do, right? And he just didn't. And again, I think because he just doesn't actually have much to say about it, maybe. Uh, this idea of the capitalism metaphor with this hypermart opened in Topeka and like wandering through the store and being amazed at all these colorful products and brands and marketing and end of aisle displays, especially kind of when you're a kid, you're really kind of, it's remarkable to go through this brightly lit store with all these bright brands and colors staring at you. And he's like, do you remember that sense or have it now of being a tentative node in a limitless networks of goods and flows? Because that's also poetry. And I get what he's saying. Like I said, I just think it's a weaker metaphor than he thinks it's doing here. Like it's not doing, I don't know. I just can't stand this kind of like like the abstract exchange. It's like, dude, like this, it doesn't work because if you're talking about abstract exchange, like there is no abstract exchange unless you get to like monetary policy or whatever thing like that. Then you get much more abstract in exchanges. But like you're literally, I don't know. It's just comparing like buying a branded cereal box for whatever and like standing in the aisle and looking at it to figure it out, comparing that to poetry and like it's limitless goods and flows. I'm just like, yeah, I understand what you're saying is like this ether, this thing that weaves in between us that's all, unsaid. I'm just like, man, like you're not making it any more concrete by comparing it to something that I would say is not applicable. Like it's just like that is a very different thing than what you're trying to talk about. But that's just I just took I was a little pissed about that. I was just like, dude, like you're just playing to the crowd now. Like you're just trying to get another fellowship that you've already gotten, I guess, at this point. But I don't know. But you mentioned that love, that last bit.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about that. There is no need to go on multiplying examples of an impulse that can produce no adequate examples, of a capacity that can't be objectified without falsification. I've written in its defense and in defense of our denunciation of it, because that is the dialectic of a vocation no less essential for being impossible. Sounds like a lot of nonsense. All right. All I ask the haters, and I too am one, is that they strive to perfect their contempt. Even consider bringing it to bear on poems where it will be deepened, not dispelled, and where, by creating a place for possibility and present absences, like unheard melodies, it might come to resemble love. My note just here written on the page is just, what? Like, what did I just read in that word salad? So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, we also go back to this goes a little bit back to Grossman for me.
yeah.
And like I think it's also maybe gesturing toward Moore's use of the genuine, but for Grossman, he does talk about I don't remember what he says exactly, and I'm going to use the wrong word, and I know it, and I don't have the book in front of me, so I'm not going to like pull up the quote, but talks about like, I don't know if it's the subject of the poem or the object of the poem or the something of the poem is always the beloved, right? There's this idea of the beloved in the poem, or that's what the poem is for or about.
Right.
So I think maybe it's trying to gesture at that. I think also very plainly, like, we've said for a very long time that hate and love are not that distant from one another, right? But like it's just it's like it feels maybe like a lazy, like what I said before is like it feels like it's just throwing this thing in there, right? Because it feels like a nice tying up of these multiple ideas into one thing. It feels like it can sort of pull everything together, but we haven't really talked about love. I think it's just another way of talking about the way all poems all actual poems, even though we must necessarily have contempt for them because they fail. And this is, his thesis, I guess. Um, we still find in them a love that we might have for them because we get this image of what its ambition is. But, I don't, that's how I read it. I don't know if I agree with it.
My whole thing is the love and hate thing that he uses. I just think is just a bad framing, mostly because it's like this kind of like, internet social media framing of things. Oh, I have a love hate relationship with my whatever, whatever it fucking is. Where a love hate relationship is very normal and human, whatever. That's how we. But it's just I don't know. It's become like a meme, and I can't stand this
Yeah.
devolving of kind of like slogans and phrases and
Yeah.
gifs from fucking the internet that has just invaded everything. Like you just can't get away from it. People just speak in meme. It's kind of remarkable to me. Not that Lerner's doing that here, but I think he is kind of bordering on that. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, just that framing. All I ask the haters.
Yeah.
Come on, dude.
The haters.
The haters.
Who
Yeah.
are the haters?
Haters gonna hate.
Like that's not even clear. Aren't the haters the same people in your definition that are I don't know. I'm like, there are just a lot of things that are not nailed down
With
here.
that,
And I think that
go for it. Huh?
what?
Go
No,
for
yeah,
it.
I just like think that's one of those things that's not nailed down. Like again, we have the dislike of poetry, the perfect contempt for poetry, the hatred of poetry. And I guess these are all, like, I don't know if these are all the same thing. We have the genuine and the virtual and the actual, and a couple of those might be the same thing, but maybe not. And one of them always fails. And it fails only, like, there are all of these terms that, like, it's just a lot. It's a lot to follow for so few pages. And I think not always in every place adequately defined. Some of them are perfectly fine. Like, even though I don't agree with them, I think if you needed to follow his understanding of what the virtual and the actual are, I think you could easily do that. I don't think the same is true for what we're talking about when we talk about hatred. I think that's just sort of like a sexy, I think it's sexier to say that than dislike or contempt.
Right.
And, it does make a sexier title, and I think there's something to be said for that.
Of course.
But overall, yeah, I think that, well, he'll always have the defense of, it's just sort of like a personal essay that doesn't actually mean to present a real theory. But I kind of think that it does. I don't know.
I hated it. I hated this book, dude.
Well, so did Mark Halliday.
Yeah. We
Who
should
said
move on to Halliday's piece.
we don't have to spend a lot of time on this. He wrote
It's a
in
short piece.
Pleiades. Yeah, he packs a lot in, and he goes through a lot, though.
And my favorite part of it was called Lerner and His Firefly. And I laughed at that. Yeah, I was like, oh, this is going to be good.
The Firefly moment.
Firefly.
Yeah, and he says a lot. He outright claims that he got Grossman's claims about poetry wrong.
Well,
Especially where he says poetry isn't hard, it's impossible, which is, he just says, yeah, this is wrong. Grossman and Halliday says, that's wrong. Grossman always wanted to show that poetry is hard, but his life was devoted to its possibility and to its value.
Well, the first
aspiration to the ideal, perfect, quote, virtual poem becomes lethal when carried too far.
What I would say, And the first thing he points out is something we pointed out too, where Holiday makes a good point about the hatred. When he's saying, what he says, there's the sensationalism of insisting on the flagrant word hatred, when really what Lerner has in mind is addressed more fairly by such words as frustration, disappointment, radical skepticism, or dislike, like in the actual Moore poem, right? Dislike.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair
well,
point. Although when you read that essay, it's a fun essay because it is very bitchy and kind of,
it's pretty mean.
yeah.
It's very bitchy. And it's like a fun read, and I am inclined to agree with him most of the way through. And I'm not a huge Halliday fan. Like, it's just like not what interests me very much right now, which is, whatever. Like, you are perfectly, like, if you like Mark Halliday, go for it. Like, no judgment. But
And he takes him to
does talk about
task, yeah.
Leonard's thesis.
Well, he takes him
And
to
he
task, like
says
you
his
said, with
thesis
Grossman.
consists of two. Yeah, well, and that his thesis consists of two claims: that poetry has a special power to induce in readers a hunger for an ideal poem, a poem that will marvelously and totally uplift us, inspire us, enlighten us, comfort us. Two, actual poems always disappoint us by inevitably falling short of such an ideal, and our disappointment darkens into hatred. Lerner implies, without ever thinking it through, that poetry has this double effect on us while other arts don't.
Well, that's what I mean, and like that's what I said. I agree. I don't think Lerner thought this through. I think it was just like whatever, And I think the part that makes Halliday's kind of rebuttal to this bitchy is that there is a little bit of bitterness. There's a little bit of that resentment in it. Like he takes some shot at the MacArthur grants, right? Like
I mean, he says, my revulsion against this tiny book is so overdetermined. Let me count the ways.
Yeah. Little nice reference there, yeah. But yeah, he says, and I think
it's outright bitchy from the jump. Like, and there's no attempt to hide that whatsoever. And because, Mark Halliday is like, he's poetry famous.
Right.
Like he's sort of safe, right?
Yeah, and I think a telling quote that I wrote down here from that Halliday piece is when you were just about there, where he was saying, Lerner believes that ultimately, beyond the frustrations he calls hatred, he loves something he calls poetry, but this something turns out to be a blissy, mind-blown, oceanic feeling separate from and happily oblivious of individual poems. And then he goes, yeah, like, I mean, and it's true. Like, it is this kind of, like, very hippie, like, whoa, man. Like, that firefly blew my mind. It's beautiful. That firefly. It's beautiful, bro. Expand consciousness. Yeah, like, that's just what and, like, it is. Like, you feel that. Like, what he calls poetry. He loves something he calls poetry. But that something turns out to be a blissy, mind-blown, oceanic feeling separate from and happily oblivious of individual poems. And that's just like, yeah, you're calling it poetry, but I mean, that's the same thing. Like, you can call something poetry. I see this in reviews all the time, movie reviews, book reviews. It's like poetry.
Yeah.
Poetry dripping from the screen. It's a canvas. Again, using all these other art forms to describe this one art form. And yeah, I mean, it's the same type of thing. I think it's naive. It's a naive, childish understanding of this stuff, and I think Holiday
and then
points that out. Yeah.
Yeah, and he talks about audience too. He says any serious discussion of the essential demands poetry makes upon readers and the essential effects it has upon readers would have to address as its first audience its most important, because most engaged and informed audience, the population of people who care intensely about poems. So this is kind of like a fucking weird sentence that I read 800 times and did not like. But yeah, it doesn't address his fucking audience. Lerner's mini book pretends to address that population, but I suspect he knows, and I'm sure the editor at FSG knows, that the actual target audience for the hatred of poetry is mostly people who are somehow pissed off or embarrassed by the fact that they don't really care about poetry. Well, I don't know if that is he saying here?
Well, I think it's the same thing as like it's the who is the us question, and I think Halliday is raising that
Yeah.
same.
I mean, well, yeah, but then he's saying who then is the writer who implicitly targets readers who don't deeply care about poetry with his essay about hostility toward poetry. The suspicion arises that the writer himself doesn't deeply care about poetry. A person who does not know what it is to love a poem is not a person who can write interestingly about the hatred of poetry. um, so I don't agree with this. I think that I think that Lerner maybe fails to acknowledge who his audience actually is going to be
Well,
here.
he
I
has
don't
no
think that
idea. I think
anybody, yeah.
again, it's like
And
it's this made
to
up.
Halliday's point, I think maybe there is that audience of people who are somehow pissed off or embarrassed by the fact that they don't really care about poetry. But I think more broadly, it's going to, if by anybody, be read by people who are already familiar with Ben Lerner as a poet.
And like you said, the title. I mean, a title like that is going to sell copies no matter what.
Yeah.
And it came out relatively recently, but yeah, I tend to agree. I think Holiday kind of what I think his essay offers. So, listeners, if you want to read this Ben Lerner's little book here, it doesn't take long to read. And then, like, if you want to read Holiday's, I would recommend everybody read Holiday's after reading Lerner's. I think Halliday vocalizes a lot of this kind of like that what Lerner is pointing out isn't necessarily like profound or like unknown. It's like, and the quote and this is again, he's a little bitchy about it here. Internet snark, again, get me on this internet. Everybody just speaks in meme now, internet snark meme. But he doesn't quite go to that level with, Holiday doesn't at least. But he says, what Lerner seems mostly to want from a poem is the pleasure in finding, for the millionth time, that it falls short of the LSD wow a firefly totalizing magic of what he calls virtual poetry. And virtual poetry is in air quotes. Yeah, he's pointing out this kind of like, yeah, dude, like you're not pointing out anything that hasn't been known for the last couple hundred years. Like it's this, and I see this all the time, is like easy arguments, like easy low-hanging fruit, and now we're just repeating the low-hanging fruit arguments by a new face. Ben Lerner has it now, and we're just doing the easy, low-level, low-hanging fruit arguments over again. Wow, LSD, wow, a firefly. LSD, wow, a firefly, totalizing magic of what he calls virtual poetry. Yeah, that's what I mean. He's talking about something that doesn't offer us any insight into the art. Like, okay, in moments of inspiration, moments of beauty, I get that poetry is trying to capture those things. But like this is something that's well known. Like this isn't like some like new breakthrough argument. Not that everything has to be that, but yeah, it is. This is why I get the sense that it's childish and it's not very well thought out. I think, maybe it was just a money grab, and I think part of the bitterness you see in Holiday takes a few shots at the publishing industry. Again, I mean, Lerner has more money, more publishing, more publications, more prestige, recognition, etc. than most current contemporary writers. He's definitely in that top percentage, right? That top 1%. So I think there might be a little bit of that coming from Lerner, is like, this guy's getting all this recognition.
You mean Halliday?
Yeah, Halliday, when he's like, this guy's getting all this record, like.
Well, yeah, because he's one who has it, but also
Right.
I think has gotten some heat in recent years. But
Who, Halliday or Lerner?
Halliday, at least by his students, from what I've heard.
Oh, of course, dude. Yeah. Well, again, it's always these people
Well,
that
he
know
teaches
nothing.
at
Yeah.
Ohio with his wife, I think.
Oh yeah. In Athens, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's old as shit now, though. Isn't he retired or about to retire?
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think he really solidifies this when Halliday talks, when he's talking about Lerner's ideal perfection that he claims we're looking for, which of course we are kind of looking for, is like, he just says, no, you're comparing the disappointing phenomenon to many better desserts. Like he uses the thing as like food where he's like, okay, if somebody says one dessert is better than another, a meal is better than another, right? He's like, you're not talking about this ideal perfection that doesn't exist, like this nostalgia in your head. He's like, no, you're comparing it to something very real, right? So you're comparing the disappointing phenomenon to many better desserts or romantic partners or novels you've encountered in actual kitchens, beds, chairs, like in actual, like it's real, like it's there. It isn't an abstraction or some ideal thing that doesn't exist. We can point to it and say, that's a better chair than this chair over here. That's a better dessert than this dessert over here. Like we can make that claim. That's why I think this is so confused. And I hate to use this word, but I mean, we said a little bit, it's elementary. Like this is elementary kind of thinking about the art. And it is kind of frustrating that somebody's pretending that this is more than just this kind of like elementary, like, you're not saying anything, dude. Like you're not making a contribution here.
Well, yeah, and Halliday says his gaga celebration of liquefied perception is something most of us had recognized as boring by the time we graduated from college.
That
floating off into a reverie about a firefly or rapidly drinking 4 beers can feel awesome, but later the experience turns out to have been vague, foggy, unconducive to interesting thoughts.
Right. It just bothers me that the whole thing hinges on this imaginary ideal perfection, right? Like again, and what I think, as I said, Holiday's a little jealous and bitter. I think it comes off a little bitter and jealous when he starts making quips.
Even just bitchy.
Yeah, well, I mean specifically when he starts making kind of insulting quips about MacArthur fellowships or, these are very coveted fellowships. Everybody wants one, right? I understand that. Yeah. I understand that, everybody wants it. Everybody who's an artist thinks they deserve it, right? And not everybody gets it, right? Only a couple people a year get it, right? So it's not like, so I don't know. You could just take that out. Like I think he made the quip of like, basically, the MacArthur disease. Like when you get a MacArthur, you start saying stupid things. And that's what I mean. It's just like a little.
I think he was also trying to be entertaining, which he succeeded at.
Yeah, and it did make me laugh when I read that. But yeah, and I think he critiques. I think my one quip with the Holiday article. I think he critiques this essay accurately. But I think he doesn't hold, and again, it's a much shorter essay. It was published in a lit journal that nobody reads because nobody reads lit journals, and so probably most people didn't read this thing. Although it is on the internet if you use the Google to find it, listeners. So he does critique accurately, but he doesn't hold Lerner to account for like these kind of claims that he makes, which bothered me, as I mentioned in like the last 3 hours we've been doing this. Bothered me specifically his claim of virtual poetry. Why is nobody taking this down? Like this is an asinine idea. Like I wish Halliday would gotten a little bit more into how ridiculous.
Well, it's just like such a basic. It's just Plato. it's just the thing, the perfect thing versus the real world representation of the thing. That the idea comes before the thing itself.
And I guess
fine, but it's not like all poems are not failures because of that, or else we wouldn't read them.
That, and I guess he's using Grossman's language, right? So that's Grossman's idea of virtual, but then Halliday says he's misunderstanding what Grossman is saying with that stuff, which I can agree with because what I've read of Grossman, he's much more coherent and careful than I think Lerner's being in this essay. But yeah, I would have liked to see... Well,
he's much more complicated.
Well, which is...
I would say he's much more, people would call it nuanced. I, can't pretend to understand it that intimately as maybe Halliday might. But yeah, I think that maybe there's like a central idea there that Lerner maybe had right, but didn't take it to the right conclusion.
Yeah, but I guess I'd have to read Grossman to be like, yeah, I really take conflict. I don't like this idea of virtual poetry versus like actual versus I just really hate this framing. I think it's not useful.
It's just so romantic and so it's just not useful.
I think your point is correct, right? Like your point is Lerner is getting at something. Like he's trying to get at something. I know I was bashing this the entire time we've been talking about it, but he is trying to get at something real that exists. He's just going about it in like this
and he
simplified
strays
way.
from it.
Right. And then when you simplify it, you
And
start
sometimes
talking.
it's like two different things that he's
Right.
talking about under one definition, and it feels muddled. Like,
And something this
there
complicated.
isn't some one thing that's called the capital H hatred of poetry. Like, I feel like you have to give more language to that.
Well, I mean,
And I don't feel like he quite does, but I do think that this idea of the constant back and forth between a defense for poetry and a denunciation of it, the art form is now failing and it's doomed. I think there's something interesting there in terms of like a historical pattern of how we do this or the reasons for which we do this, but
well, I think he's getting at something
yeah.
real, like the conflict that occurs in somebody's head to create, right? I think he's talking about that, but I think he's, again,
Oh yeah.
it's difficult. One, that's a difficult thing to articulate, period. It's a complicated thing because it involves very much, we start going out of the realm of art here and we start getting into human psychology. We start getting into human behavior, reaction, feelings, all these, chemical reactions in our brain. We could go that route. We could. I mean, I'm not expecting him to go that route, whatever. This is a book about poetry theory, but it's like, he's just not taught. He's simplifying that to the point where it's incoherent now. This is like, because it can't be simplified to that point. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Well, or it's like it's too, yes, but it's maybe oversimple, like it's overly simplified, and it's also overly mysticized.
What's coming is it's misdiagnosed. It's misdiagnosed as hatred. Again, it's like misdiagnosed as this fucking internet meme where it's love hate relationship. You're a hater, bro. Like it's this fucking internet meme language, and he's using that like it's misdiagnosed. Like, that's not what it is, which I think Holiday correctly points out. It's much more difficult than that. Like it's much more complicated than that. And when as soon as you simplify it, and I think this is why he kind of weaves in and out of all these kind of lofty ideas. He kind of goes into the 2016 like political fervor that was going on, and then he kind of weaves back into like these kind of Plato. And I'm just like, dude, like you're misdiagnosed. Like you're like I don't know. I mean, you're talking about something that I don't know. I just can't stand this idea of calling it virtual. Like you're calling thought processes virtual poems. Like that should disqualify everything you say after this. I haven't read Grossman's stuff on
Yeah,
it.
well,
I'd be
it's
interested
just
to
like
read
it
it
was.
to see what Grossman actually
Well, his
means
stuff
by
on
it.
it is
But
just an essay about Hart Crane.
okay,
Yeah, I think that we sort of cross through too many ideas that don't really get either distinguished from one another adequately or defined adequately, or like,
well,
it's just, it becomes kind of like hard to follow other than this thread of all poems fail because they are not the idea of the poem. They're not this like perfect idea that we have of the poem, which like on some level, we could say is a true experience for a poet, but I'm sure that you also feel at some point like you write something really sexy sometimes and are surprised at how good it is, right?
mm-hmm.
Like I think there's like so much musing in a really romantic way about why poems fail without having to do the thing where you point to a particular poem and say why it's not good enough. Like you just now have, I mean, which he does at one point, but like it's just there's this blanket statement that you can apply and say that all poems fail, and somehow I guess this is yeah, I don't know.
Well, because he's
like the hatred thing I get really hung up on because
right.
I'm not ever sure which kind of hatred we're talking about or whose hatred we're talking about. Is it the hatred of poetry by poets, by the people who decide to denounce poetry that is not, that doesn't necessarily exclude poets. Like there are many in that category, I'm sure. Is it the hatred of poetry by people who have no interest in poetry, in which case it's more indifference?
Right.
I think audience is important here. And I think, yeah, I don't know who this is for, really.
Well, I think because he misdiagnoses it, so because he's talking about something that's like, he ends up making an argument that says you just shouldn't make judgments because he's confused and misdiagnosing what he's
Or that
actually
it's
talking
somehow
about.
like impossible. Not
Right.
that, well, it's not that you shouldn't make judgments, it's that by reading bad poems, you're having an experience of what the ideal poetry is.
Well, the reason I say this is because
And I feel like,
his only argument for like why people hate it is that they're comparing it to some what he calls a poetic ideal or ideal poetry in their heads, right? He's saying that it doesn't exist. I think Holiday rightfully takes that down and says, "No, here's a couple examples of ideal poetry that
yeah,
exist in the world."
I just,
So making that
I just
argument,
think if Lerner, I think if he isolated like each one of these claims and wrote just that essay, it would be really, like he could write something compelling. If it was, uh, you know,
well, and I mean,
oh, what
I'll
was I just
mention
saying?
this is completely devoid of craft, right? Like, there's no talk of craft in this book. Like, there's no talk of
Well, he talks about it a little bit when he talks about that one super bad poem about
yeah.
the Tay Bridge disaster, whatever. Um,
But that's what I
but
mean.
yeah, I think if he isolated this to talk about different pieces of this, it just feels like too many arguments that could be made that he is trying to force together. Like he is trying to square with one another. And I don't know that you can, but I do think that you could maybe write each of these as individual arguments without having to try to tie them up so neatly, and actually like honestly explore each of these claims as an individual essay. Maybe not an 86-page essay, but
That's what I
you
mean
know.
is he's making these kind of lofty claims that he doesn't go into because he's misdiagnosed what he's actually talking about, and then he has to keep doubling down and going into these kind of lofty, again, very abstract, what he
So
calls
what is he actually
ideals.
talking about? Because I feel like what he's actually trying, I feel like the one concrete thing that he's coming back to is, you know, why do we, oscillate between defending poetry and telling everybody that it's dead? Um,
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I was pressed, if somebody put a gun to my head and said, "What's this book about?" I would be like, "Oh, judgment is bad." I don't know. I really have no idea what he's saying. Like, that's what kind of confuses me and irritates me about this. But I think Halliday was feeling that too. It's because this book is held up as if it's making, I mean, not that it's held up so much, but it's held up to like, as if it's making some kind of really important point about the art and how people feel about it. And like I said, I think it's really just a lot of nothing. It's a lot of like, I don't know, which is why he keeps going back to these abstract things because he has nothing to say. So he just keeps pulling. I mean, again, when you're going this abstract, you can pull anything into it, right? Like
well,
you
it
can.
feels it feels like in a lot of ways it feels like a lyrical essay that wants to be like a, you know, craft essay or a theory essay. But
Yeah, and it
hey,
ends up being neither because it's so preoccupied.
um,
But
and
yeah,
like again, like you could write that essay that's like, yes, the experience of reading bad poems makes us extra aware in some way of what those poems are lacking, what would make them a positive experience, and by virtue of that, we ultimately do get some positive thing out of it. I think you could write that essay and it would be fine. But yeah, it, it was tough to follow in places. It felt very sensational as I was reading it, or for somebody who is interested in poetry and has been for some time. It felt like, oh, this feels sensational. This feels like
right.
a very buzzy. you
I
know,
mean, it is.
essay. So yeah,
But it
uh,
gets back to that question. Yeah. So who are these things for? Who are these defenses for?
yeah. I mean,
And what are they for? Kind of thing. Like, is poetry hurting right now? Like, is poetry any?
I think I'm gonna say that they're for exactly who ultimately reads them,
Right.
which is again poets mostly.
I
I don't know many people who read poetry but don't write it. I don't know many people who read about poetry that don't write it. And like, I would be so happy to hear that, we're, I don't know. Maybe I'd be indifferent. I don't know if I care about how wide the poetry audience actually is. But I do think ultimately that is who it's for. I don't think you can like write the words virtual poem, capital P poem, and not be writing for, you know, an audience that already has some familiarity. This feels very much like it's speaking to poets and to, you know, people already in that world. And I think that's probably true of most defenses and most denunciations. What are you going to do? Tell the general public that poetry is dead? They don't care. It's already been dead to them. But like, I mean, in terms of defenses, I think it's sort of twofold. I think that some probably hope to reach a broader audience, right?
yeah.
I think it depends on what the actual purpose of the defense is. Like, I think if it's saying that poetry has purpose, like some kind of social or socio-political purpose, it really depends. I think ultimately you're going to end up with a readership that is mostly poets, but possibly more than that. I think a wider audience is more likely to read a defense than a denunciation, depending on like the language that it uses and who it sort of postures itself for. But it's always going to be mostly people who already exist within that field.
I would say that the audience for this is just the people that asked him to write this for a book deal, dude. I mean, I don't know who these defenses are for. I think more recently, like whenever you see this stuff, it's based on internet comments, so strangers online. That's who people
Or,
are like.
it's
Yeah,
for us to make ourselves feel better about
yeah,
the shitty poems that we're not writing because we just have these beautiful, perfect virtual poems existing in this
right.
otherworldly
That's
abstract
what I mean. He's
space.
basically arguing that you shouldn't bother to write it because your brain's better than whatever's. I mean,
Well,
like
maybe
that's
that's
it's
just where he's at in his career,
yeah,
man.
but I
Maybe
just
he's just not writing.
I just can't believe that
And
that's
he
a
just
serious thing being argued by somebody at his level. I just can't believe that that's a serious, legitimate thing. Not just that he did it, but that people are actually praising it for it. Like this honestly makes your art look worse. Like this makes people like poetry less. Like like I don't get it.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much praise this got.
But that
Um,
and like you always talk about this too, like the audience. Like what are we talking about? This kind of it's again it's this abstract audience. It's this oh why do people being this big abstract term hate poetry? Why do they love poetry? And again it's this like
yeah, I don't think they feel either of those things
right
toward poetry.
when in reality most
Most
people
of
don't
them.
care. Yeah, most people are so indifferent. Like it's not
Except
like
for like the stray, high school sophomore who was forced to be introduced to it and decided in that moment that they hated it and stuck to it. But I don't think most people have like an active hatred that takes up quite so much energy as hatred tends to.
yeah, well, when I think that's the thing too. When people say hatred now, that they're talking about something that isn't actually. Again, like hatred takes so much energy. Oh, I hate this. It's just like it's not actually what they mean, right? Like it's not like I think that too. I think people just don't like things that require stuff of them, right? Like it's a selfish reason. Like it's why do people hate poetry? Well, because it requires something of them and they don't want to do that.
And
Like
people
so
don't Yeah, I
It's
also
more.
think
It
people
requires
don't
work.
love to read as much
Well,
because it requires work.
well, the same
And
reason
I
people
say
don't
that
want
as
to
someone
read.
who has like fallen into the trap of fucking loving audiobooks, which I always have.
Yeah.
Like always, like I was a shitty reader as a kid, and audiobooks really fucking helped me be able to like, ultimately read without audio behind it. uh, but like, yeah, it's fucking convenient because it doesn't absorb
Require
all of
work.
your fucking
Right.
attention.
Well, that's what I mean. People just don't like
Um,
work.
that's just part, but that's
Yeah.
also just part of where we are at, like as a culture, and like, okay,
Right.
like we have all these technologies now, we have the means to do this. Audiobooks are far more common, and so like people who were largely not readers up until now probably are, like, at least, dipping a toe in, which is
I doubt it,
probably
dude.
mostly good.
I doubt it. I mean, all statistically, all the sales of books, everything's down. Nobody's reading shit. Again, maybe that's where these defenses stem from.
Reading versus listening, we can get into that later,
Yeah.
but
I
it's a
mean,
talk for another time.
I've soured on audiobooks. I hate audiobooks now. The hatred of
I love
audiobooks.
audiobooks.
The hatred of
Fucking love
audio.
audiobooks so much.
The hatred of audiobooks.
I love only half committing
No, but
to a
you see,
book.
Soph, you only
What?
hate it. I see. I only hate audiobooks because it's not as good as what I pictured in my head before I went there. Like that's the only reason.
Oh, you like the virtual audiobook?
Yeah, according to Lerner, yeah. That's
Um,
again, that's a good
no,
application of his nonsense logic in this book right there. Yeah.
yeah, I fucking love audiobooks.
Yeah.
They're great.
Well, for me, it's the same thing you said. I don't like them because I tend to drift in and out. Like I miss things because of
Yeah,
audiobooks. It allows
which
me
is the same
to.
reason why a lot of people fucking love them,
Right, exactly. It takes the work out of it.
because you can drift in and out.
Right.
You don't have to be staring at it.
Again, you can passively
But
consume. This is the whole thing. Like he doesn't mention this at all. He talks about it being specifically poetry that people passively consume. No, it's all art. There's a small section of people that care about this deeply, and then everybody else is just a passive consumer. They buy this album by Ariana Grande because that's what they hear on the radio. They don't actually like, oh, I
and it's
love
catchy as
music.
fuck.
Yeah, I love
You
music.
become familiar with it.
Yeah, they buy it because it's like, oh, yeah, yeah. Passively consume this while I'm in the background doing something. Like, yeah.
That's also like, which isn't to say that people who are like in love with music don't also like what's popular, but also a different story for a different day.
Yeah, so final thoughts for me. I hated this book. Offered me nothing. I was pretty frustrated. But what else is new, dude?
I liked the virtual book, but the actual one failed a little bit for me. But it's not its fault. It fails by virtue of existing in this world.
Yeah, dude. I mean, it's absurd. It's an absurd fucking argument. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, again, like when you put it in that way.
I would love to see. Listen, I would love to see a collection of essays from Ben Lerner, The Hatred of Poetry, right? Where he does a breakdown of this argument into several shorter essays. Listen, I'll buy the book, okay? I'll do the Amazon review of it. I'll do all this shit. Listen, I think it's annoying. I think I said this of his novel. It's entertaining. It's smart. It's annoying as shit. Again, that's how I feel about autofiction generally. It's almost always annoying as shit to me. But
Does he write autofiction?
I mean, you look at 1004 and pretty sure the central character's name is Ben Lerner and is a poet and, goes to Marfa, Texas and is living in New York City and, all of the things that Ben Lerner also does and has done and is named. But I mean, it wasn't like bad. It it had an air of, and maybe it's just like the self-reflexivity of it all, or just there's something in it that's just annoying. And I could never quite put my finger on it. And I was like, you know what? I do both hate and kind of enjoy this, and I can't. And maybe my annoyance slightly outweighed my liking.
Right.
So it became that much more confusing. Usually you can largely like something and be like a little annoyed by it. But I felt like I both hate and kind of enjoyed this, and I'm not sure what to do with that. And I spent a semester just not really being able to figure it out. So I assume it's just that it's autofiction and that it's so clearly, Ben Lerner, the novel.
Well, so I mean, I think autofiction is just. I mean, if I was going into my elaborate theories, autofiction, the popularity of autofiction is just showing that like how devoid of imagination our culture is. We're just so obsessed with ourselves that we can't think of any actual ideas of
Well,
our
that's
own.
what it
So we
feels
just,
like. I think
yeah.
that's what feels annoying. It feels a little bit self-absorbed,
Well, it
which,
is. I mean,
and which fucking writers are, and like whatever, but maybe don't show me through the character who is you.
yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, 1004, it's a pretty good book. You should read it.
I
You
guess
should
I'll
buy
read
it.
it.
And to all of you out there, I hope you'll also read The Hatred of Poetry and, tell us what you think.
No, we don't care what you think. Don't tell us.
Okay.
Put it in the
Defer to
comments.
Andy.
Put it in the comments. Yeah. Is that it?
Yeah, go and look up some really good pictures of Ben Lerner so you can put the face to the words, if that, I mean, not that that really matters. If you care more about the virtual Ben Lerner than the actual Ben Lerner, do not look it up.
Yeah, dude. You can also, if you just type in Midwestern, like Midwesterner into Google, I think a picture of him just shows up. Like,
Do we count Kansas as the Midwest?
I would.
I am not very intelligent. Directionally speaking. Not good at maps.
Right.
But it's okay. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, you're probably right. It's one of those states that I can't tell if it's like the South or the Midwest or both. And I lived in Kentucky for a while, and I was always pretty confused by it there too. It's like, so you're Southern? Okay. This is the... Okay. But that's Ohio right there. But this is the South? All right.
Yeah. We get snow here. Like,
But
yeah.
Ohio's right across this bridge.
Yeah.
And so is Indiana? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that it? Nothing else on this crap?
I mean, like, how much more time are we going to spend on this?
Yeah, I can't spend any more time on it, dude.
Gassing.
I just asked that.
Out.
Yeah, I just asked that
I think
to
I
make
gassed
sure.
out like an hour ago.
I just asked that to, yeah. I just asked it to make sure that we're like, all right, nothing we didn't gloss over, anything you wanted to hit before we officially stop,
Dude, there's nothing else.
Right,
We've gone
yeah.
so far. It's been 3.5 hours.
Good.
It's been 3.5 hours of Ben Lerner, dude.
Yeah, it's too much for
The
Ben
second
Lerner,
shortest book we've ever read. The second shortest prose we've ever read.
All right, yeah. So, if you want to contact us to tell us about how wrong we are about Ben Lerner, you can contact us at our actual email address, heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/heavyboard. Receive full uncensored episodes for subscribers only. That includes bonus content and everything else we do with this. Check out and subscribe to our YouTube channels for more. Links to all the books and everything we covered in the description, as well as the holidays essay. And next episode, we're doing... what are we doing next episode, Soph?
Some shit.
No, we have it on my list here. All right, shit. Okay, we're doing
Yeah.
Pimp by Iceberg Slim.
Oh man, fucking are we?
Yeah, dude.
I don't know if I'm ready for that, dude.
Oh, dude, I like that every time we do something that's like fucking poetic theory, we just go into something that's just like referring to cocaine and fucking within the first 2 sentences. Like, I like that idea.
I have my dad's copy of that book.
Yeah, dude, classic, throwback. It's an important book. All right, yeah. So next week we're doing Pimp by Iceberg Slim. This has been Heavy Board. My name's Andrew Wittstadt.
I'm Sophie Weiner.
I guess we'll see you next time.
Fuck out. Don't come back.
Yeah.
Get the fuck out of here. Run away.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources. American resources.
Being bored,
Some activities are intentional, right?
it shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom,
Heavy.
I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.